Hey y'all, it's been a while since I did a true iceberg format video, and I got the idea for this one after seeing Zonefly cover a similar topic. Since I live in Appalachia myself, I wanted to make my own version, 79 stories of folklore, mysteries, strange history, cryptids, hauntings, and local legends. For this iceberg, anomaly doesn't just mean paranormal, it means anything strange, forgotten, unexplained, or hard to separate from rumor and memory. This is the Appalachian Anomalies Iceberg. Let's start. Flatwoods Monster. On the evening of September 12, 1952, several children near Flatwoods Elementary School in Braxton County, West Virginia, saw a bright object streak across the sky and appear to come down on land owned by a farmer named G. Bailey Fisher. The boys ran to tell Kathleen May, mother of two of the children. Instead of dismissing them, she joined the search, along with several local kids, a dog, and West Virginia National Guardsman Eugene Lemon. The group climbed toward the hillside where the object seemed to have landed. As they approached, the dog ran ahead barking, then came back frightened. Near the top of the hill, they saw a pulsing red light. A strange mist hung in the air, carrying a metallic odor the witnesses said burned their eyes and noses. Then Eugene raised his flashlight. In the beam, the group claimed they saw a towering figure in the darkness. He was described as around 10 feet tall, with a round red face, glowing eyes, and a head or hood shaped like the ace of spades. Its lower body appeared dark, metallic, and folded, almost like armor or a stiff dress. Some accounts mention small claw-like hands. Others make it sound more like a machine than a living creature. The figure reportedly hissed and glided toward them, which caused the group to flee. Afterward, several witnesses reported nausea, throat irritation, and vomiting. Authorities found no creature, though later reports mentioned trampled grass, skid-like marks, a lingering odor, and dark residue, details that have been debated ever since. The Flatwoods Monster was never confirmed, but it became one of West Virginia's defining legends. More than 70 years later, the creature from that hillside remains one of Appalachia's strangest and most recognizable oddities. Brown Mountain Lights. In the mountains of western North Carolina, near Linville, Georgia, and the Pisgah National Forest, people have reported strange lights around Brown Mountain for generations. The lights are usually described as glowing orbs, star-like points, or balls of light appearing along the ridge, above the trees, or deep inside the gorge. Some drift slowly, others move quickly, pulse, split apart, rise into the air, or vanish without warning. Witnesses have described them as white, red, orange, yellow, blue, and green. The Brown Mountain Lights are often watched from Wiseman's View, the Brown Mountain Overlook on Highway 131, and the Lost Cove Overlook along the Blue Ridge Parkway. Many say the best chance of seeing them is on a cool, clear fall night, especially after rain. Even then, they remain rare and unpredictable. The legends attached to them are almost as strange as the sightings. Some stories say they are spirits searching after an ancient battle between the Cherokee and Catawba. Others call them ghostly lanterns, lost miners, Civil War dead, or souls of people who vanished in the gorge. In the 20th century, the lights became tied to UFO lore and alleged alien encounters near Brown Mountain. Investigators have tried to explain them for more than a century. Train lights, car headlights, brush fires, moonshine steals, fireflies, distant towns, atmospheric refraction, ball lightning, and unusual electrical effects have all been suggested. Some sightings probably do have ordinary explanations. Others may be tricks of weather, distance, and mountain air. But the legend survives because every so often, someone stands at the edge of the gorge, looks into the dark, and sees something moving where light shouldn't be. The Mothman. In the fall of 1966, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, became the center of one of America's strangest cryptid legends. The creature would become known as Mothman. One early report came on November 12th when 5 men digging a grave near Clendon claimed they saw a brown human-like figure rise from the trees and fly overhead. But the sighting that made the story famous happened 3 days later near Point Pleasant's old TNT area, an abandoned World War II munitions site north of town. That night, Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Millette were driving near the old power plant when they saw something standing in the darkness. They described a tall, winged figure, roughly 6 or 7 feet high, with a human-like body and large glowing red eyes. Terrified, they sped away, but the creature reportedly lifted into the air and followed their car toward town, gliding without flapping its wings. The next day, newspapers reported the encounter, and the name Mothman soon followed. Over the next 13 months, more sightings and strange reports came from the Point Pleasant area. Witnesses described a huge bird-like humanoid, strange lights in the sky, eerie sounds, and an atmosphere of fear around the TNT area. Then, on December 15th, 1967, the Silver Bridge between Point Pleasant and Gallipolis, Ohio, collapsed during rush hour, killing 46 people. After that, local sightings seemed to fade. The timing transformed Mothman from a frightening creature into something more ominous, a possible warning, omen, or harbinger of disaster. Explanations range from misidentified cranes and owls to mass hysteria, UFO activity, and supernatural theories, but the legend never disappeared. Today, Point Pleasant has a Mothman statue, museum, and festival, turning one dark roadside encounter into one of Appalachia's most enduring mysteries. The Greenbrier Ghost. In 1897, in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, a woman named Elvazona Heaster Shue was found dead in the home she shared with her new husband. She had only been married to Erasmus Strebling Trout Shue for a few months. He was a blacksmith, sometimes called Edward, and Elva's mother, Mary Jane Heaster, had never trusted him. When Elva's body was discovered, Edward's behavior deepened her suspicion. He reportedly handled the body before the doctor arrived, dressed her in a high-collared outfit, placed fabric around her neck, and stayed close to her head during the viewing. The doctor performed only a brief examination and first attributed the death to natural causes, and she was buried soon after, but her mother refused to accept it. In the weeks after the funeral, she claimed her daughter's spirit appeared to her on multiple nights. According to Mary, the ghost said that Edward had killed her in a fit of rage, breaking her neck because there had been no meat prepared for supper. Mary took the story to the prosecutor, a man named John Alfred Preston, and whether he believed the ghost or not, he did begin asking questions. The investigation uncovered suspicious details. The doctor admitted he had not fully examined her body. Edward's past also raised concerns, including earlier marriages, a criminal record, and stories of cruelty. Authorities ordered her body to be exhumed. The autopsy revealed her neck was broken, her windpipe was crushed, and there were marks consistent with strangulation. Edward was arrested and tried for murder. During the trial, Mary testified about the ghostly visits. The prosecution relied mainly on physical evidence, but the spirit story became inseparable from the case. The jury convicted Edward after about an hour of deliberation. He was sentenced to life and died in prison in 1900. Today, it's one of Appalachia's most famous supernatural cases, remembered as the trial where a ghost helped convict a murderer. Wampus Cat. Across Appalachia and the American South, people have long told stories of a strange cat-like creature known as Wampus Cat. Depending on where the story is told, it might be called Wampus, or the Galley Wampus, or the Whistling Wampus. Its description changes, but most versions agree on the basics. It is large, dark-furred, and feline, with glowing yellow or green eyes, powerful claws, and a scream that sounds disturbingly human. Some say it moves like a panther, others say it walks upright. In certain tellings, it has 6 legs, supernatural powers, or the ability to vanish into the woods. The legend is often linked to Cherokee stories. In one version, the Wampus Cat was once a woman who secretly followed the men of her village and listened to sacred stories she was forbidden to hear. When discovered, she was punished by being bound forever inside the skin of a mountain lion transformed into something half woman and half cat. Another version gives the creature a more heroic origin, connecting it to a woman named Running Deer, who used the spirit of the mountain cat to defeat a demon that had driven her husband mad. In that telling, the Wampus cat is not only a monster, but a guardian watching the dark places beyond the village. Outside those stories, the Wampus cat became a backwoods warning. In Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, North Carolina, and beyond, children were told not to stay out after dark. Farmers blamed it for dead livestock, missing chickens, mutilated dogs, and screams in the night. Like many Appalachian creatures, the Wampus cat lives between folklore, fear, and memory. It may have began with panther screams echoing through the hollers, but over time, those screams became something stranger, a glowing-eyed thing in the trees. The Moon-Eyed People. Deep in the folklore of Appalachia, there are stories of a mysterious group known as the Moon-Eyed People. Accounts often connected to Cherokee tradition describe them as living in the southern Appalachians before the Cherokee arrived. They were said to be small, pale-skinned, sometimes bearded, and unusually sensitive to sunlight. Because they could not see well during the day, they were called moon-eyed and were believed to come out mostly at night. One of the earliest written references comes from one of the first professors of natural history in America, Benjamin Smith Barton, in 1797. He wrote that the Cherokee had found the land inhabited by people who could not see in the daylight and had eventually driven them out. Later writers, including James Mooney, repeated similar traditions about a strange earlier population that lived in the mountains before disappearing westward. The legend is strongly tied to Fort Mountain in northern Georgia, where a low stone wall zigzags across the mountain. No one knows for certain who built it. Some have claimed the Moon-Eyed People constructed it as a defense against the Cherokee. Others see it as ceremonial, astronomical, or the work of an earlier indigenous culture. Another object linked to the story is a talc and soapstone statue found near Murphy, North Carolina in the 1800s. Its large rounded eyes and unusual shape have been interpreted by some as a representation of the Moon-Eyed People. Theories about their identity have multiplied. Some people believe they were a real pre-Cherokee group. Others suggest people with albinism or another condition causing light sensitivity. One famous theory connects them to Prince Madoc, a Welsh explorer said to have reached America before Columbus, though there is no solid evidence for that claim. The truth is uncertain. They may be a memory of an earlier native group, a distorted colonial story, or one of Appalachia's legends about hidden people in the hills. Snallygaster. In the hills of western Maryland, people once told stories of a flying monster called the Snallygaster. The creature was strongly tied to Frederick County, especially in the mountains and valleys around Middletown, South Mountain, and Braddock Heights. Its name is often linked to the German phrase Schnellergeist, meaning quick spirit, reflecting the German immigrant communities that settled the region in the 1700s. Descriptions vary, but most make it sound like something built from several nightmares. The Snallygaster was said to be part bird, part reptile, with enormous wings, a long pointed beak, claws like steel hooks, and sometimes a single eye in the center of its forehead. Some versions gave it octopus-like tentacles trailing behind it as it flew. According to the old stories, it swooped from the sky, snatched victims, drained their blood, and vanished into the mountains. To protect themselves, some families painted 7-pointed stars on barns, believing the symbol could keep the creature away. The legend exploded in 1909 when Maryland newspapers began printing sensational reports of sightings. The beast was said to scream like a locomotive whistle, attack people near remote roads, and even attracted the attention of the Smithsonian and President Theodore Roosevelt. The reports were later understood as a newspaper hoax, likely created to boost readership. Still, the Snallygaster did not disappear. In the 1930s, it returned to print, tangled with Prohibition-era stories about moonshiners hiding in the mountains. One tale claimed the creature was overcome by fumes from a massive vat of moonshine, where it then fell in and died, only for revenue agents to destroy both the steel and the remains. Today, who remains one of Maryland's strangest cryptids. Sheep Squatch. In the hills of West Virginia, there are stories of a creature known by two names. Some call it White Thing, others call it Sheep Squatch. The name sounds almost ridiculous, but the descriptions are not. Witnesses describe a large white animal, somewhere between a bear, a dog, and something stranger. It is said to have shaggy wool-like fur, horns like a goat or ram, sharp teeth, powerful limbs, and a terrible odor, sometimes compared to sulfur. In some stories, it walks on 4 legs. In others, it rises onto 2. The odor roots may go back to West Virginia's White Thing folklore, including stories collected in Ruth Ann Music's 1965 book, The Telltale Lilac Bush, and other West Virginia ghost tales. In one tale, a woman riding home from church is charged by a white beast. She escapes, but the next morning, her horse is found dead and badly torn apart. By the 1990s, the creature had become closely tied to southwestern West Virginia, especially Boone County. In 1994, 2 children reportedly saw a large white, bear-like animal in their yard. When it stood up, it appeared to be more than 6 feet tall, before fleeing into the woods, snapping branches as it went. Another account from around that time describes a white creature drinking from a creek before vanishing into the brush. In 1995, a couple driving through Boone County claimed to see a hulking white beast crouched in a roadside ditch. When they slowed down, it allegedly lunged at their car, leaving deep scratches behind. Later, campers in the same region reported something snorting and circling near their fire before charging from the dark. Whether Sheep Squatch is its own monster or a newer name for older White Thing legends is hard to say, but in a state known for Mothman and the Flatwoods monster, it's earned its place as one of the strangest local beasts. Appalachian Bigfoot types. Long before Bigfoot became a household name, Appalachia already had its own stories of wild, hairy giants moving through the mountains. One of the oldest is the Yahoo, a creature sometimes connected to Daniel Boone. Later in Boone's life, stories circulated that he had once killed a 10-foot, man-shaped beast covered in hair. Boone reportedly called it a Yahoo, borrowing the name from Gulliver's Travels, a book he was known to enjoy. That makes the story hard to pin down. It may have been a real frontier claim, a tall tale, or a literary joke that grew into a legend. But either way, the image stuck. Daniel Boone, deep in Kentucky, speaking of a massive hairy humanoid before modern Bigfoot lore existed. That same wild man tradition carried into eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, where similar creatures were described as huge, dark-furred beings with terrifying screams, glowing eyes, and a habit of staying just beyond the edge of settlement. In eastern Kentucky, the hillbilly beast is said to roam the hills near Ohio River, leaving behind guttural cries, thrown rocks, and tree knocks in the dark. In southwest Virginia, the creature has another name, the wood booger. Around Norton, Wise County, and Flag Rock, it is described as a large, hair-covered humanoid moving through the forest after dark. The name booger comes from an older mountain word for something frightening, like a boogeyman. Today, Norton has embraced the legend, even declaring itself a wood booger sanctuary. Further north, Ohio has the Grassman, a Bigfoot-like creature tied to wooded hills, strip mines, and old gravel pits. Its strangest trait is its supposed habit of building crude shelters from grass, sticks, and leaves. The best-known case came from Minerva, Ohio in 1978, when a family claimed a large dark creature repeatedly appeared near their home. Together, the Yahoo, wood booger, and Grassman suggest that Appalachia's Bigfoot stories are not one legend, but a whole family of mountain wildmen. Grafton Monster. On the night of June 16, 1964, reporter Robert Cockrell was driving home from the Grafton Sentinel in Grafton, West Virginia, when his headlights caught something strange along Riverside Drive near the Tygart Valley River. At first, he thought it was a large white obstruction standing between the road and the water, but as he got closer, it seemed alive. He later described it as a massive pale figure somewhere between 7 and 9 feet tall, with slick seal-like skin and no obvious head. Its body was broad, strange, and almost featureless. Nothing like anything he expected to see on a quiet road outside town. Terrified, he sped away, but curiosity pulled him back. He called 2 friends, Jerry Morse and Jim Mauser, and the 3 returned to investigate. The creature was gone. They found no clear tracks, but the grass and brush near the riverbank appeared to be mashed down, as if something large had recently been standing there. While they searched, they also heard a low whistling sound from the direction of the river. Within days, the story spread through Grafton. Teenagers formed monster hunting parties, heading out with flashlights, bats, crowbars, and whatever they could find. Some claimed they saw the creature too, and the Sentinel reported on the strange excitement taking over town. But the panic faded quickly, and a follow-up article suggested that the monster may have been a person pushing a handcart or bicycle piled with boxes, distorted by darkness and imagination. Decades later, Cockrell himself wrote that there was no Grafton monster, and that the story had grown from a strange shape on a dark road into something much larger. Still, the legend stayed alive. The Grafton monster became one of West Virginia's stranger cryptids, a pale headless figure born from one late night sighting. Kecksburg UFO. On the evening of December 9th, 1965, people across several states and part of Canada saw a brilliant fireball streak across the sky. To astronomers, it looked like a meteor burning through the atmosphere, but in the small village of Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, the story became something stranger. Witnesses near Kecksburg reported hearing a heavy thump, feeling vibrations, and seeing smoke rising from the woods. Soon, local searchers, volunteer firefighters, state police, and military personnel were drawn to the area. Some residents later claimed that the woods were sealed off, and that whatever came down was not simply a meteor. The most famous description is one of a metallic object shaped like an acorn or bell, roughly the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. It was said to be bronze-colored with markings around its base that reminded some witnesses of Egyptian hieroglyphs. According to several accounts, the object was loaded onto a flatbed truck covered with a tarp and taken away by military personnel. Officially, the event was treated as a fireball, most likely a meteor. Other explanations have included Soviet space debris, a failed probe, or an American re-entry vehicle from a classified program. NASA later stated that fragments from the area had once been examined and linked to a Soviet satellite, but the records were reportedly lost. The missing paper trail deepened the legend. FOIA requests, lawsuits, documentaries, and interviews kept the case alive. In 1990, Unsolved Mysteries brought Kecksburg national attention, using a prop of the alleged object that still remains in town as the famous Space Acorn. Today, Kecksburg is often called Pennsylvania's Roswell, and thus Appalachia's Roswell. Not deer. At first glance, it looks like a deer. This is what makes the story so unsettling. The knot deer is a modern Appalachian cryptid built around a simple idea. Something stands in the road or at the edge of the trees, and your mind wants to call it a deer, but the longer you look, the less certain you become. The legs seem too long, the joints bend wrong, the eyes face forward, more like a predator than a grazing animal. Sometimes it moves stiffly, as if learning how its body works. Sometimes it only stands there and stares. Unlike other Appalachian legends, the knot deer does not seem to have deep roots in traditional folklore. The name spread online in the late 2010s, especially through Reddit, Tumblr, TikTok, and weird Appalachia circles. But the fear behind it is older than the internet. Anyone who has driven a dark mountain road knows the shock of headlights catching eye shine in the brush. Deer are familiar, but they are also strangely still, silent, and, when sick or injured, deeply wrong. Some accounts describe deer walking upright, screaming, clicking, approaching people instead of running, or moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Others are quieter, just a deer that looks slightly misshapen, watches too closely, and leaves the witnesses feeling that something is not right. There are natural explanations for many stories. Chronic wasting disease can make deer thin, confused, drooling, and less afraid of humans. Other illnesses, injuries, malformed antlers, and rutting behavior can make an ordinary animal seem disturbing. But the knot deer is not really about proving a new species. It's more about when something familiar becomes unfamiliar. Cornstalk's Curse. At the meeting point of the Ohio and Kanawha rivers, in what is now Point Pleasant, West Virginia, stands one of the darkest legends in Appalachian history, the Curse of Chief Cornstalk. Cornstalk, whose Shawnee name was Hokolesqua, was one of the most important native leaders of the Ohio County before the American Revolution. In 1774, he led Shawnee and allied warriors against Virginia militia at the Battle of Point Pleasant. Though his forces were defeated, Cornstalk later became an advocate for peace, hoping to keep the Shawnee neutral as war spread between Britain and the American colonies. In 1777, Cornstalk traveled to Fort Randolph at Point Pleasant on a diplomatic visit. He reportedly came to warn settlers the younger Shawnee warriors were being encouraged by the British to attack frontier settlements. Instead of being allowed to leave, Cornstalk, his son, Elenipsico, and several others were detained inside the fort. Then, on November 10, 1777, a militiaman was killed nearby by unknown native attackers. Furious soldiers blamed the prisoners. Ignoring officers who tried to stop them, they stormed the cabin and murdered Cornstalk, his son, and others in revenge. The legend says that as Cornstalk lay dying, he cursed the land where he had been betrayed. From then on, disasters around Point Pleasant were tied to his final words: floods, fires, lightning strikes, industrial accidents, the 1967 Silver Bridge collapse, and even Mothman. But the curse itself is probably not historical. The famous wording appears to come from a much later dramatic play performed in Point Pleasant, not eyewitness accounts. Those who were present recorded no supernatural speech. Still, the legend lived on because the real event was tragic enough. Cornstalk came to Fort Randolph as a voice of restraint and was killed by people he was trying to warn. Swift's Silver Mine. Somewhere in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, southwest Virginia, or eastern Tennessee, legend says there is a lost silver mine that has never been found. It is known as Swift's Silver Mine, and the story begins with an Englishman named Jonathan Swift. According to the legend, Swift came to the Appalachian frontier around 1760, before Daniel Boone became famous for exploring Kentucky. One version says George Munday led him to the silver after learning of the mine while held captive by native people. Another says Swift found it following a wounded bear into a cave. Inside, he supposedly discovered a rich vein of silver. For years, he and his men returned to the site, mining ore, casting bars, and even minting coins. Some versions claim he buried thousands of dollars worth of silver across the mountains, marking the locations with trees, rocks, creeks, and clues in his journal. But the operation eventually fell apart. The stories mention native attacks, dangerous terrain, betrayal among Swift's crew, and even murder. Eventually, Swift is said to have sealed the mine and left. Before he could return, he went blind, leaving him unable to find the hidden entrance again, and he died with the secret still lost. For 2 centuries, treasure hunters have searched for Swift's mine. Claims have been made in Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee. Some link it to Wolfe County, Kentucky, where Swift Creek and the Swift Silver Mine Festival keep the legend alive. Others point to caves near Pine Mountain or to old counterfeiters who seem to have unusual amounts of silver. But the mystery has one major problem: geology. No major silver deposit matching the legend has ever been proven to exist in the region. So Swift's Silver Mine may be a lost treasure, a frontier hoax, or one of Appalachia's most persistent tall tales. Appalachian Black Panthers. Across Appalachia, stories of large black cats have been passed down for generations. They are usually called Black Panthers, though the name is more complicated than it sounds. Panther is not one specific animal. It can refer to several large cats when they appear solid black, usually because of melanism, a dark pigmentation found in animals like leopards and jaguars. But the animal most often linked to Appalachian sightings is the mountain lion, and wildlife experts generally say there has never been a confirmed black mountain lion. That has not stopped the stories. From Tennessee and Kentucky to West Virginia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, people describe long-tailed black cats sleeping across roads, stalking field edges, or vanishing into the timber. Some accounts mention glowing eyes. Others describe the sound, most associated with old panther lore, a scream in the woods, often compared to a woman crying out in the dark. For early settlers, panthers were not fantasy. Cougars once ranged across much of eastern North America, and frontier language was full of names for them: panther, painter, catamount, and mountain lion. In the mountains, those names lingered long after official maps and wildlife records changed. The mystery is the color. If witnesses are not seeing black cougars, then the possibilities become something stranger. Some sightings may be ordinary animals, misjudged in poor light. Others may involve escaped exotic cats, especially in areas where private ownership was once loosely regulated. A few people have even wondered whether jaguars, which historically ranged further north than many realize, might explain some of the reports. For many families, though, the Black Panther is not a debate. It is something a grandfather saw near the creek, something that screamed out from a hollow, or something that crossed the road in the headlights and disappeared before anyone could reach for a camera. Judaculla Rock and the Slant-Eyed Giant. In Jackson County, North Carolina, near Cullowhee, a soapstone boulder sits covered in carvings older than anyone can fully explain. It is called Judaculla Rock, and its surface holds more than 1,500 petroglyphs, circles, lines, cut marks, tracks, figures, and abstract shapes cut into the stone. It is one of the most important rock art sites east of the Mississippi River, but to the Cherokee, it is more than an archaeological site. It is a sacred place tied to hunting grounds, spirit places, and the being known as Sulkaloo. Sulkaloo, often anglicized as Judaculla, is remembered as a powerful figure of the mountains, sometimes called the Slant-Eyed Giant, but he was not simply a monster. In Cherokee tradition, he was connected to game animals, hidden places, and the deep rules of the wild. Hunters entering his territory were expected to show respect. One story says the markings on the rock were left when Judaculla leapt down from his mountain home to drive away hunters who had entered his land without permission. As he landed in the valley, he stumbled and placed his hand against the stone, leaving an impression. With his fingernail, he carved a warning into the rock. Other interpretations see the markings as a symbolic map of mountains, rivers, towns, trails, and sacred places. Archaeologists have also found evidence of ancient soapstone quarrying nearby, and the carvings may have been made over many centuries. Today, Judaculla Rock is protected by Jackson County and Cherokee preservation efforts. Its meaning has never been reduced to just one answer. Instead, it's been used for many different things. Back Creek Stone. In 1889, during a Smithsonian excavation near the Little Tennessee River in Loudoun County, Tennessee, field assistant John Emmerich reported finding a small engraved stone inside a burial mound at Back Creek. The object was only a few inches long, but the marks carved into it became one of the strangest controversies in American archaeology. Cyrus Thomas, who directed the Smithsonian's mound investigations, first identified the inscription as Cherokee. At the time, that seemed to support the idea that native people had built the ancient mounds of the eastern United States, a point that mattered in an era when many still claimed the mounds belonged to a vanished Old World race. For decades, the Back Creek stone was mostly forgotten. Then researchers noticed that when the inscription was turned upside down, the characters no longer looked like Cherokee. To some, they resembled ancient Hebrew. This led to claims that the stone was evidence of Jewish or Near Eastern contact with Tennessee more than 1,000 years before Columbus. The idea was sensational. If true, it would rewrite part of North American history. But archaeologists soon pushed back. The strongest case against the stone came from Robert Manfort and Mary Quaz, who argued that the inscription was not ancient at all. In 2004, they identified a strikingly similar line of Paleo-Hebrew style characters in an 1870 Masonic reference book. Their conclusion was that the Back Creek inscription had likely been copied from that illustration and planted during the excavation. That turned the artifact from proof of ancient contact into something just as revealing, a window into 19th century archaeology, when frauds, rival theories, and arguments over who built America's mounds all collided. Today, the Back Creek stone is widely considered a hoax. Grave Creek Stone. In Moundsville, West Virginia, the Grave Creek Mound rises more than 60 feet above the Ohio River Valley, one of the largest conical burial mounds in North America. Built by the Adena people sometime around 250 to 150 BC, the mound was already ancient when European settlers arrived, but in 1838, when Abelard Tomlinson and others tunneled into it, they reportedly found something even more mysterious than the burials themselves, a small sandstone disc covered with strange markings. It became known as the Grave Creek Stone. The object was less than 2 inches wide, inscribed on one side with roughly 24 characters arranged in lines. To 19th century scholars, the marks look like they might belong to an unknown alphabet. Some compared them to Greek, Etruscan, Runic, Phoenician, Hebrew, Celtic, or ancient Spanish scripts. If genuine, the stone could suggest writing in ancient North America, or even contact with Old World peoples before Columbus. But from the beginning, the story was sketchy. Accounts of the discovery did not fully agree. Some said it come from the upper burial vault. Others said it was found in loose dirt removed from the mound. The original artifacts later vanished, leaving behind only drawings, cast, and a single known photograph. As decades passed, an inscription became less like evidence and more like a puzzle no one could solve. Modern research has pushed the Grave Creek Stone into the realm of archaeological fraud. Anthropologist David S. Stryker identified the apparent source of the inscription, an 18th century book on ancient Spanish coins and monuments. The marks seem to have been copied from that volume, including unusual character sequences and errors. Today, the Grave Creek Stone is widely considered a hoax, but the mound itself is not. Ignoring all the controversy over the stone, we still have a real Adena monument built by native hands more than 2,000 years ago. Haunted rail tunnels of Appalachia. Across Appalachia, some ghost stories follow old railroad lines, where tunnels, trestles, and isolated cuts through the mountains became places of accident, rumor, and haunting. In Vinton County, Ohio, the Moonville Tunnel is all that remains of a small mining town once built around the Marietta and Cincinnati Railroad. The town vanished by the 1940s, but the tunnel stayed behind, along with stories of those killed on the tracks. Locals once walked the rails between communities, and in the narrow space near the tunnel, there was little room to escape an oncoming train. Out of those deaths came the legend of a ghostly brakeman carrying a lantern through the dark. Some see only the light swinging near the tunnel mouth. Others describe a figure in old railroad clothes, sometimes headless, vanishing into the woods. In Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, the legend of Screaming Jenny tells of a poor woman who lived near the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. One cold night, her clothing caught fire. Panicked and burning, she ran screaming toward help, only to stumble onto the tracks as a train came around the bend. The engineer could not stop in time. Since then, witnesses have claimed to see a ball of fire moving along the rails, sometimes followed by screams, or the feeling of a train striking something that is no longer there. Farther west, in Wheeling, West Virginia, Hempfield Tunnel carries an even darker reputation. Built in the 1850s beneath Old Peninsula Cemetery, the tunnel was already tied to uneasy stories of trains passing below the dead. But its most infamous legend comes from 1867, when Alois Ulrich was murdered there by Joseph Eisel, a German immigrant later connected to multiple hatchet attacks. Afterward, travelers claimed to hear groans and pleas from inside the tunnel, and some spoke of a mutilated figure warning the living to let the dead rest. From Moonville to Harp's Ferry to Wheeling, these haunted rail tunnels preserve the same fear that some tracks do not end just because the trains are gone. The Dragon of the Lower Mahontongo. In the old folklore of central Pennsylvania, Lower Mahontongo was not always just a stream. According to a legend recorded by Henry Wharton Shoemaker in Susquehanna Legends, the valleys along the Susquehanna were once troubled by a great demon or dragon. The creature tormented the native people who lived in the rich county near the river, refusing to leave even when commanded by the Great Spirit. In the story, the Great Spirit, known as Getchi Manito, ordered the monster to abandon the place, but the dragon resisted, so instead of driving it away, the Great Spirit transformed it. The monster became a stream, and its two horns became the two branches of the waterway. That stream was the Lower Mahontongo. The name Mahontongo has been interpreted in different ways, but it is often connected with abundance, good hunting, and a place where there was plenty to eat. The land around it was fertile, watered by the Susquehanna watershed, and remembered as a place of richness. Shoemaker's telling gives that abundance a supernatural explanation. The stream itself was once a defeated monster, forced into the landscape and made part of the world it had threatened. The tale is often linked to Lenape tradition, though, like many stories preserved by early folklorists, it comes through later written retellings. Still, the story sticks with you. A dragon refusing to leave the valley, then being reshaped into the water, its body winding through the land, and its horn splitting into branches. In that form, the monster never disappeared. It became part of the landscape. Black Jack Swartz, the Black Hunter of Juniata. Across the Juniata River Valley of Pennsylvania, the name Captain Jack still lingers on the landscape. There's Jack's Mountain, Jack's Narrows, and Jack's Creek, but the man behind the name is much harder to pin down. In legend, he was known as Black Jack, the Black Rifle, or the Wild Hunter of Juniata. Some accounts call him Jacob Swartz. Others identify him as Patrick Jack, Joseph Ager, John Fenwick, or even suggest the legend may have grown from several frontier figures blended into one. The basic story is always the same. Jack was a dark-haired, dark-complexioned woodsman living in the Pennsylvania frontier during the French and Indian War. He had a cabin, a wife, and children. One day, after returning from a hunting trip, he found his home burned and his family dead. From that moment on, the peaceful hunter becomes something else entirely. He vanished into the forest and caves of Juniata Valley, moving through the mountains like a ghost. Settlers claimed he protected remote cabins from raids, appearing only long enough to fire his rifle before disappearing back into the dark timber. In one famous tale, a family woke in the night to a gunshot and saw an attacker fall outside their door. Standing at the edge of the light was the Wild Hunter, who told them he had saved their lives, then vanished into the woods. Other stories grew around him. He supposedly offered his band of backwoodsmen to General Braddock before the doomed march on Fort Duquesne, only to be rejected. Some later writers claimed that if Braddock had listened, the disaster might have been avoided, but historians have found no firm record of the meeting, and much of Captain Jack's story rests on folklore, local memory, and later retellings. Whether he was a real man, a distorted memory of multiple frontier figures, or a legend created by a violent age, Captain Jack became a symbol of the Pennsylvania borderlands, part scout, part avenger, part ghost of the mountains. Old Green Eyes. On the battlefield of Chickamauga, Georgia, people still talk about something watching from the trees. They call it Old Green Eyes. The legend is tied to the Battle of Chickamauga, fought in September of 1863 near the Tennessee-Georgia border. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, with tens of thousands killed, wounded, captured, or missing. For 2 days, the woods and fields around Chickamauga were filled with smoke, gunfire, confusion, and death. And according to local folklore, something remained there after the armies moved on. Old Green Eyes is usually described as a pair of glowing eyes seen in the darkness near places like Snodgrass Hill and Walder Tower. Sometimes, the eyes appear alone, floating in the woods. Other times, witnesses describe a tall, human-like figure with long dark hair, animal-like features, fangs, or a distorted face. Some versions say that it is a ghost of a soldier who lost his head during a battle and now searches the field for his missing body. Other versions claim that the creature is older than the war itself, something drawn to the violence and suffering that took place there. One of the best known modern encounters came from Edward Tenney, a historian and chief ranger at Chickamauga Chattanooga National Military Park. In 1976, while walking the grounds early in the morning, Tenney claimed that he saw a figure in a long dark coat with stringy hair. As it passed, it turned and showed him a terrible grin, with eyes that seemed greenish-orange in the dark. Moments later, headlights from an approaching car swept across the road, and the figure vanished. Other witnesses have reported green eyes glowing through the fog, strange figures near the battlefield roads, unexplained voices, hoofbeats, and the feeling of being watched after sundown. There is no solid Civil War era record proving that soldiers actually saw Old Green Eyes in 1863. The legend seems to live more in local memory than official history, but at Chickamauga, that almost feels fitting. Haunted Appalachian Trail Shelters. The Appalachian Trail is usually imagined as a place of escape, ridgelines, campfires, and shelters tucked deep in the woods, but some of those shelters carry stories that are harder to shake off once the sun goes down. One of them is Vandeventer Shelter, perched on a ridge above Watauga Lake in Tennessee. By day, it offers one of the most memorable views in the area, but according to trail lore, a young woman was murdered there sometime in the 1970s, and her spirit is said to return on rainy nights. Hikers who arrive during bad weather describe the shelter as cold, exposed, and unsettling, with wind whipping across the ridge and rain hammering against the roof. Whether anything supernatural happens there or not, it is easy to understand how a lonely shelter, a dark storm, and an old murder story could turn an ordinary night into something much heavier. Other shelters along the trail have similar reputations. Wapiti Shelter in Virginia became tied to stories of hauntings after a double murder occurred there decades ago. Hikers still talk about strange noises, uneasy feelings, and the discomfort of sleeping alone in a place already marked by violence. Sometimes the explanations are simple: mice in the rafters, acorns falling in the dark, wind moving through the trees. But in the middle of the night, those explanations do not always feel comforting. The Thelma Marks Shelter on Cove Mountain in Pennsylvania carried an even darker legacy. In 1990, hikers Jeffrey Hood and Molly LaRue were murdered there by drifter Paul David Cruz. The shelter was eventually replaced, but the crime remains one of the Appalachian Trail's most infamous tragedies. These stories blur the line between ghost lore and true crime. Some shelters are remembered because of the legends, others because something terrible really happened there. Either way, they remind hikers that the trail is not just wilderness. Blood Mountain. Blood Mountain is one of the most ominously named places on the Appalachian Trail, rising more than 4,400 feet in North Georgia. It is the highest point of the trail in the state, standing inside Chattahoochee National Forest near the border of Union and Lumpkin counties. The name comes from more than one explanation. The most famous legend says that long before white settlers arrived, Cherokee and Muskogee Creek warriors fought a terrible battle near Slaughter Gap between Blood Mountain and Slaughter Mountain. The fighting was said to be so violent that blood ran down the slopes and turned the nearby streams red. Whether that battle happened exactly as told is uncertain, but the story has been repeated for generations, giving the mountain an atmosphere that is hard to separate from its name. There is also a quieter explanation. Some believe Blood Mountain was used not for war, but for the red lichen and catawba rhododendron that grow around the summit. In that version, the mountain's color name came from the land itself, not from anything spilled there. Cherokee tradition gives the area another layer. Blood Mountain was said to be connected to the Nunahi, immortal spirit people who lived in the hidden townhouses throughout the old Cherokee Highlands. These beings were often described as helpful, guiding lost hunters and travelers back to safety. Near Lake Trelada, one of their mythical townhouses was said to stand. Today, Blood Mountain is known to hikers for its steep climb, rocky summit, old stone shelter, and sweeping views across the southern Appalachians, but it also has a darker modern reputation. The area is now known for heavy bear activity, and hikers camping in the wilderness are required to use bear-resistant food storage. It was also the setting of the 2008 Meredith Emerson case, one of the most infamous crimes connected to the Appalachian Trail. Roan Mountain Phantom Choir. High along the border of North Carolina and Tennessee, Roan Mountain rises into one of the most atmospheric places in Appalachia. It is not a single sharp peak, but a long high ridge covered in spruce, fir, and rhododendron, with the Appalachian Trail crossing its windswept heights. In bloom, the mountain can look almost unreal, but for generations, people have said that Roan Mountain does not just offer views, it sings. The legend is usually called the Phantom Choir or Ghost Choir of Roan Mountain. According to the story, under the right conditions, strange voices can be heard moving through the wind. Some listeners describe the sound as beautiful and distant, like an angelic choir practicing for Judgment Day. Others hear something darker, wailing, moaning, and tortured cries rising from somewhere below the mountain. The reports became especially well known during the era of the Cloudland Hotel, a grand resort built on the mountaintop in the late 1800s. Guests came for the cool air and sweeping views, but some left with stories of eerie music in the storms. One story tells of a young man who ignored warnings and hiked out during bad weather. When a thunderstorm overtook him, he heard terrible voices in the wind and took shelter in a cave. Then, the sounds grew louder, and he claimed to see spectral, damaged figures circling him until he passed out from fear. Not everyone believed the sound was supernatural. In 1878, naturalist Henry Colton heard a strange humming or cracking noise on the mountain and suggested it might come from wind currents and electrical friction along the ridgeline. Others have blamed the shape of the mountain itself, saying that the slopes and gaps amplify the wind until it begins to resemble voices. Roan Mountain is also associated with rare circular rainbows seen when sunlight, rain, and elevation align just right. Between the strange music, the clouds, the storms, and the high lonely ridges, the mountain has the perfect ingredients for legend. Lucy of Roaring Fork. Along the edge of Gatlinburg, Tennessee, the Roaring Fork Motor Nature Trail winds through one of the most historic sections of the Great Smoky Mountains. Today, visitors drive the narrow loop road for waterfalls, old cabins, mountain streams, and quiet forest scenery. But according to local legend, one lonely spirit still walks the road after dark. Her name is Lucy. The story is usually set in the early 1900s, before the creation of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, when families still lived in small mountain communities like Roaring Fork. Lucy is said to have been a young woman who died tragically when her family's cabin caught fire on a cold winter night. Some versions say she was only 17. Others describe her simply as young, beautiful, and barefoot. Not long after her death, a man named Foster was riding through the area when he saw a girl walking alone in the cold. She had no shoes and seemed lost or hurt. Foster offered her a ride, either on his horse or in his carriage, and she accepted. During the ride, he became captivated by her. She was quiet, charming, and mysterious. When he dropped her near her home, she slipped away before he could learn much about her. Unable to forget the encounter, Foster returned the next day to ask her family for permission to see her again. But when he described the girl, her parents gave him impossible news. Lucy had died in a cabin fire, either weeks or years before. Since then, people have claimed to see a barefoot young woman wandering near Roaring Fork, especially in fog, winter cold, or fading light. Some describe her as a vanishing hitchhiker. Others say they feel a sudden chill near the old cabins, or the uneasy sensation of being watched. Nolan Creek Lantern. Deep in the North Carolina side of the Great Smoky Mountains, the Nolan Creek area is filled with traces of a vanished world. Old homesteads, abandoned cemeteries, and forgotten family lands still linger in the forest, while nearby Lake Fontana covers places that once belonged to early mountain communities. Out of that lonely landscape becomes the legend of the Lantern of Nolan Creek. According to the story, a young farm girl wandered into the woods and became lost. As mist settled through the trees, she called out for her father, but every step only seemed to carry her deeper into the forest. When her father realized she was missing, he took a lantern and searched desperately through the night, calling her name again and again along the creek and through the dark timber. But the girl was never found. The father kept searching until his strength gave out. Later, he was discovered dead in the woods, still without any sign of his daughter. Some versions of the tale say the two were reunited in the afterlife. Others say the father never stopped looking. For generations, hikers near Nolan Creek have told stories of a strange lantern light moving through the trees. It appears in the distance, bobbing and flickering like someone walking with an old hand lantern. Unlike many ghost lights, this one is not always described as threatening. Some say it guides lost hikers back towards safety, leading them through the dark until they find the trail again. Whether the light is the ghost of a grieving father, a trick of mist and moonlight, or just another Smoky Mountain tale, the legend fits in well, because Nolan Creek is already haunted by memory. Old homes, old graves, and land that was left behind. Wizard Clip. In the lower Shenandoah Valley, in the village now called Middleway, West Virginia, one of Appalachia's strangest ghost stories still lingers under a different name, Wizard Clip. The story began in the 1790s when Adam Livingston, a Lutheran farmer from Pennsylvania, settled his family on land that was then still part of Virginia. According to the legend, a sick stranger arrived at the Livingston home and asked for shelter. The family took him in, but as the man grew worse, he asked for a Catholic priest. In some versions, Livingston refused. In others, there simply was no priest nearby to call. Either way, the stranger died without last rites and was buried on the property. Soon after, the household was taken by disturbances. Candles would not stay lit. Crockery crashed onto the floor. Stones rolled across rooms. Sounds of horses and wagons thundered through the house with no visible source. But the most famous sign was the clipping. The family heard the sound of unseen shears moving through the home, and afterward, clothing, bedding, boots, saddles, and curtains were found cut into strange shapes, often crescent moons. One visitor supposedly wrapped a silk cap inside a handkerchief to protect it, only to later find the handkerchief untouched while the cap had been sliced to ribbons. Livingston sought help from ministers and local religious figures, but the haunting continued. Finally, after a dream of a man in dark robes, he contacted Father Dennis Cahill, a Catholic priest from Shepherdstown. Cahill visited the property, blessed the home, and later returned with Father Demetrius Gallitzin, a well-known missionary priest. Prayers were said, mass was offered, and according to the tradition, the Wizard Clip came to an end. The story did not stop there, however. The Livingstons later claimed to hear a mysterious voice that taught them Catholic prayers and doctrine, and the family eventually converted. In 1802, Livingston deeded his 35 acres of land to the Catholic Church, a property still known as Priest Field. Appalachian folk beliefs. In Appalachia, folklore was not always something lurking in the woods. Sometimes it lived inside the home, in the sick room, at the funeral, beside the beehive, or hidden beneath the floorboards. Long before doctors were easy to reach, many mountain communities relied on women known as granny women, granny healers, or, in later language, granny witches. They were not always thought of as witches by the people who knew them. Many were deeply Christian, using Bible verses, prayers, herbal remedies, and knowledge passed quietly through families. They delivered babies, treated burns, prepared the dead, and offered protection when there was nowhere else to turn. A cure might be as simple as catnip tea or a poultice, or as strange as talking the fire out of a burn, stopping blood with a whispered verse, or reading signs in weather, animals, and dreams. The same world of belief extended into the house itself. Witch bottles filled with pins, nails, thorns, broken glass, and sometimes personal traces of the afflicted were hidden near doors, hearths, chimneys, or under floors to trap harmful forces before they could enter. Blue bottle trees and glass witch balls served a similar purpose, catching spirits, bad luck, or haints before they reached the family inside. Everyday life carried its own rules. Leave a house through the same door you entered, toss salt over your shoulder if it spills, never give a knife as a wedding gift unless a coin is exchanged, or the blade might cut the love. Around death, customs grew darker. Clocks were stopped, mirrors were covered, doors or windows were opened so the soul could leave. A screech owl, a bird in the house, or an empty rocking chair moving by itself could all become warnings. Even bees had to be respected. In the old custom of telling the bees, a death in the family was carried out to the hives. Someone would knock gently and tell them the news. If the bees were not told, they might leave, stop making honey, or die. And then there was the Sin Eater, a dark funeral legend said to have crossed from Britain into the mountains, an outcast who ate food placed near the dead, taking their sins so the soul could pass on. Jack Tales. In Appalachian storytelling, Jack is much more than the boy who climbed a beanstalk. The Jack Tales are a cycle of folk stories carried through the mountains by oral tradition. especially in parts of North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky. Their roots reach back across the Atlantic to the British Isles, where stories of clever boys named Jack, Jock, or similar names had been told for centuries. When settlers from England, Scotland, Ireland, and the Scotch-Irish backcountry came into Appalachia, Jack came with them. In the mountains, Jack became a familiar figure around hearths, porches, and work fires. He was not a polished fairy tale prince. He was poor, scrappy, sometimes lazy, sometimes foolish, but almost always lucky. He could trick giants, robbers, witches, landlords, wild animals, and anyone else who stood between him and survival. If he did not win by strength, he won by cleverness. If cleverness failed, luck often stepped in. These stories were not only entertainment. Before television, radio, or even electricity reached many mountain homes, tale-telling helped pass along evenings, quiet children, and make hard work feel shorter. Jack's adventures taught listeners that the world was dangerous, but not unbeatable. A poor boy with nothing but nerve and a quick tongue could still come out ahead. The best-known Appalachian collections came from families around Beech Mountain, North Carolina, especially the Harmon and Hicks storytelling traditions. Richard Chase's 1943 book, The Jack Tales, helped introduce these stories to a wider audience, while storytellers like Ray Hicks kept them alive in performance, voice, and memory. There are many Jacks. Sometimes he had brothers named Will and Tom. Sometimes he had a mother, a stepmother, or no clear family at all. Sometimes he is a fool. Sometimes he is the smartest person in the room. But in every form, he belongs to the same old storytelling world, one where the weak outwit the powerful, and the road into trouble may also be the road to fortune. See, in Appalachia, Jack never really left the beanstalk. Instead, he just climbed down into the hollers and kept going. Telepo. Deep in Appalachian folklore, there is a creature known by many names: Telepo, or two words, Tele-po, or Telebones, or Tailbones. But no matter what the storyteller calls it, the story usually begins the same way, with hunger, isolation, and a cabin far back in the woods. The creature is often described as something between a cat, a dog, and a nightmare. It is dark-furred, low to the ground, with glowing eyes, sharp claws, pointed ears, and a long tail. It is not quite an ordinary animal, because it can speak, and the only thing it ever seems to say is a demand for what was taken from it. In the most familiar version, an old hunter lives alone with his dogs during a season when food is scarce. One night, desperate for something to eat, he sees a strange animal near his cabin, or out in the woods. He attacks it, cutting off its tail. The creature escapes, screaming into the darkness, while the man takes the tail home and eats it, sometimes cooked into a stew. That night, as he tries to sleep, he hears scratching outside the cabin. Then comes the voice, "Telepo, Telepo, give me back my Telepo." The man sends his dogs after it. They chase the creature away, but one dog does not return. The creature comes back again, repeating its demand. Another dog disappears. Then, the last one. By the final visit, the hunter is alone, trapped in the dark with the thing he wronged. Some versions say the Telepo tears him apart. Others say he simply vanishes, leaving only the cabin chimney behind. In children's versions, the ending may be softened, but the warning remains. Telepo is more than a jump scare. It is about hunger, cruelty, and the danger of taking from the wild without respect. The creature might be monstrous, but it is also only asking for what belonged to it. Cherokee spirits and monsters. In Cherokee tradition, the mountains of the southern Appalachians were never empty. They were a living world of spirits, monsters, hidden people, and beings far older than humans. High above the Little Tennessee River, the Lanua were enormous hawk-like birds said to nest in cliff caves, carrying away dogs, livestock, and even children. In one story, their young were thrown into the river, where the horned serpent, Uctina, rose from the deep and devoured them. The returning Lanua attacked the serpent from the sky, tearing it apart and scattering its power across the mountains. Uctina itself was one of the most dangerous beings in Cherokee lore, a vast horned serpent with scales like sparks of fire and a blazing crystal in its forehead, called the Alunsuti. That crystal could bring prophecy, healing, rainmaking, and power, but winning it meant facing a creature whose very gaze could lead to death. Other beings were smaller, but no less mysterious. The Yungwi Junsti, or Little People, lived in caves, hollow places, and hidden slopes near streams. They could help lost children, guide wanderers, or finish chores in the night, and disturbing them could bring confusion, tricks, or worse. The Nunahi were stranger still, immortal spirit people living in unseen townhouses beneath mountains, mounds, rivers, and bald peaks. They were said to protect the Cherokee in times of danger, shelter lost travelers, and even lead some families away from disaster before the forced removal. But not all beings were protective. Spearfinger, the stone-skinned liver eater, could disguise himself as a kind old woman before striking with a blade-like finger on her hand. And the Ravenmocker came at night when someone was sick or dying, stealing their last breath of life to extend its own. Taken together, these stories reveal a Cherokee world where cliffs, rivers, caves, sick rooms, and mountain passes were all alive with presence. Ottagahi. Somewhere deep in the Great Smoky Mountains, Cherokee tradition tells of a hidden lake called Ottagahi. Its name has been translated as Gall Place, but the legend gives a meaning far beyond that. Ottagahi was not a lake for ordinary travelers, hunters, or map makers. It was a sacred place, known first to the animals. The lake was said to lie in the high mountain country between North Carolina and Tennessee, west of the headwaters of the Oconaluftee River. A person wandering nearby might hear the rush of wings, the sound of ducks and birds circling over the water, but if they followed the noise without proper preparation, they would find only a dry, empty flatland with no lake, no birds, and no signs of life. To see Ottagahi, a person had to fast, pray, and keep vigil through the night. Only at daybreak, if they were spiritually ready, would the dry place reveal itself as a shallow lake of beautiful purple or blue water, fed by springs falling from cliffs. Fish, reptiles, birds, deer, and bears gathered there, but none were there to be harmed. Ottagahi was a medicine lake. Wounded animals, especially bears, were said to know the hidden road to its waters. A bear struck by a hunter's arrow could enter the lake and emerge healed on the other side. That is why the animals kept the place concealed from humans. One story tells of a young hunter who found the lake and marked the spot with stones. Later, during a starving winter, he returned and shot a bear there, but the bear rose from the water unharmed and told him he had broken his sacred promise. After that, the lake was lost to him forever. Another tale speaks of two Cherokee children, Utani and Netani, who found the lake by accident after a kicked pebble splashed into the hidden water below the trail. Jura, Spain's Roanoke. Before Roanoke, before Jamestown, there was Jura, near present-day Morganton, North Carolina, in the Catawba River Valley. Jura was already an important native town long before Europeans reached the Appalachian foothills. Established around 1000 AD, it grew into a political, economic, and ceremonial center, surrounded by rivers, creeks, low mountains, farms, and smaller settlements. In 1540, Hernando de Soto's expedition passed through Jura while searching the southeast for wealth and empire. His route into the mountains was shaped by one of the most striking figures in the chronicles, the Lady of Cofetachequi, a female chief taken hostage by the Spanish after they failed to find the gold expected in her homeland. Forced to guide them north, she led them toward the mountains instead, then slipped into the woods and vanished. De Soto's men never found her again. More than 25 years later, Spain returned. In late 1566, Captain Juan Pardo left Santa Elena on modern-day Parris Island, South Carolina, hoping to claim the interior for Spain and find an overland route toward Mexico's silver mines. By January 1567, he reached Jura. Snow covered the mountains, making further travel difficult, so Pardo asked Jura's town leader, called Mico, for permission to build a fort and small settlement nearby. That fort became Fort San Juan. The settlement was called Cuenca. For about 18 months, Spanish soldiers lived beside Jorah, making this the earliest known European settlement in the interior of what is now the United States, almost 20 years before Roanoke and 40 years before Jamestown. The arrangement did not last though. The Spaniards depended on native communities for food and misunderstood gift exchange as submission, and they were also accused of improper relations with native women. In 1568, native men from the region struck back. Fort San Juan and 5 other Spanish forts were burned. Nearly every Spanish soldier was killed. Only one survived to report what had happened. For centuries, the site faded from memory. Then, archaeologists at the Bury site uncovered Spanish artifacts, burned buildings, and eventually the fort's defensive moat. In 2013, Fort San Juan finally re-emerged from the soil, and for a brief moment, Appalachia almost became the beginning of Spanish America. Lost Cherokee town of Niquosi, in the middle of Franklin, North Carolina, surrounded today by traffic, buildings, and modern streets. There is a mound older than the town itself. Niquosi, also known as Niquosi, means star place. Long before Franklin existed, this was the heart of a Cherokee mother town on the floodplain of the Little Tennessee River. The town covered roughly 100 acres and served as a spiritual, cultural, and ceremonial center for the Cherokee people of the region. The mound itself is believed to have been built around 1000 AD, during the Mississippian period. On its summit once stood a Cherokee townhouse, where councils were held, delegations were received, and the sacred fire was kept burning. In Cherokee tradition, that fire connected the people to the beginning of their culture. Niquosi was also associated with the Nunahi, the immortal spirit people said to live beneath the mound and protect the Cherokee in times of danger. The site appears in colonial records by the early 1700s, but its importance was already ancient by then. In 1730, Sir Alexander Cumming met Cherokee leaders there and claimed to appoint Moitoi as Emperor of the Cherokee, part of a questionable colonial effort to secure allegiance to King George II. In 1761, during the French and Indian War, British forces used the townhouse as a field hospital. In 1776, during the Revolutionary War, Griffith Rutherford's militia burned Cherokee towns and crops across the region, including Niquosi. Still, the mound remained. In 1819, the Cherokee were forced to cede the surrounding land, and Franklin eventually grew around the sacred site. For generations, the mound was treated more like a roadside relic than a living place of memory. In 2012, after herbicide was sprayed on the grass, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians called it a desecration in renewed efforts to regain control. In 2019, Franklin transferred the mound to the Niquosi Initiative. Then, on February 26, 2026, after more than 200 years, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians officially regained ownership. Fort Mountain Stone Wall. High on Fort Mountain, near Chatworth, Georgia, a broken stone wall winds across the summit like the remains of something half-forgotten. The wall is nearly 900 feet long, built from stones gathered from the mountain itself. In places, it rises only a few feet. In others, it once stood higher and wider, zigzagging along the crest in a pattern that has puzzled visitors, historians, and archaeologists for generations. He gave Fort Mountain its name, but whether it was ever truly a fort is still debated. Early explanations tied the wall to Hernando de Soto, the Spanish explorer who moved through the southeast in the 1500s, searching for wealth and conquest. Some imagined his men building a defense against native people in the region, but that theory has mostly fallen away. De Soto's route and the brief time he spent in the area makes it unlikely that his expedition built anything so large. Others reached for stranger answers. One legend connected the wall to Prince Madoc, the supposed Welsh explorer said to have sailed to America in the 12th century. Another tied it to the Moon-Eyed people of Cherokee tradition, a mysterious race described in some accounts as pale, small, and better able to see at night than in the daylight. According to the legend, they lived in Appalachia before being driven out by the Cherokee. The most accepted explanation today is that the wall was built by native people, possibly sometime between the Woodland and Mississippian periods. Its purpose, though, remains uncertain. Some people have suggested a defensive barrier, but the wall is so low in places, contains no water source, and does not always follow the strongest military position. Others believe it may have marked a sacred or ceremonial space on the mountaintop. Much of the wall has collapsed, and many of its stones now lie quiet beneath the trees, but the shape is still there, bending through the forest, a line on a rock that seems to lead backward through time. Hopewell Interaction Sphere. In the Ohio River Valley, the Hopewell people built some of the most remarkable earthworks in ancient North America. Between roughly 200 BC and 500 AD, they raised mounds, walls, circles, octagons, and ceremonial spaces that could cover hundreds of acres. But the strangest part of the Hopewell world is not only what they built, it is what they gathered. Inside their mounds, archaeologists have found objects made from materials that came from astonishing distances. Copper and silver came from the Great Lakes. Marine shells and shark teeth came from the Gulf Coast or Atlantic coast. Obsidian, a black volcanic glass, has been traced all the way to the Yellowstone region, more than 1,500 miles from Ohio. And then there was mica. Thin sheets of shining mica were cut into hands, claws, birds, serpents, mirrors, and other sacred forms. Much of that mica came from the southern Appalachian Mountains, especially western North Carolina. For years, it was thought that the raw material was carried north and shaped in the Hopewell heartland, but discoveries at Garden Creek, near the Appalachian source area, suggest that some mica working may have happened there, on the edge of the Hopewell world, before the finished pieces were carried into Ohio as offerings. This vast movement of materials is called the Hopewell Interaction Sphere. It may not have been simple trade. If it were, archaeologists might expect to find a clear trail of goods moving from village to village. Instead, the pattern suggests something deeper: pilgrimages, sacred journeys, direct expeditions, and ritual exchanges between distant communities. The Hopewell were not one empire or one tribe. There were many communities connected by shared symbols, ceremonies, and objects of power. The world stretched across rivers, forests, mountains, and coastlines, linking places that seem impossibly far apart. The Rogan Plates of Etowah. Near Cartersville, Georgia, beside the Etowah River, lies the remains of one of the great Mississippian towns of the southeast. Etowah was occupied for centuries, roughly between 800 AD and 1550 AD, by people belonging to the Muskogee Creek Confederacy. At its height, around 1300 AD, several thousand people may have lived there, making it one of the largest and most important Middle Mississippian communities in the region. The site once held 7 mounds. 6 remain today. The largest, Mound A, rises about 63 feet and spreads across roughly 3 acres at its base, a flat-topped platform where elite buildings once stood above the town. Around the settlement were defensive works, a ditch, timber walls, and the Etowah River itself forming part of the boundary. This was not just a ceremonial place. It was a living, fortified town with houses, fields, political power, and ritual life. Etowah is especially famous for what came out of Mound C, the burial mound. Excavations uncovered shell beads, stone pipes, pottery, ornaments, woven cloth fragments, and some of the most iconic artworks ever found in the ancient southeast. Among them were the Rogan plates, thin hammered copper plates showing a dancing birdman figure, holding a mace in one hand and a severed head in the other. The image belongs to the wider southeastern ceremonial complex, a shared world of symbols tied to warriors, elites, the upper world, and sacred power. Some scholars believe the plates may have been made at Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, then carried south, copied, or adapted by artists at Etowah. The site also produced 2 remarkable painted marble statues, one male and one female, whose details show Mississippian clothing and hairstyle. After European contact in the 1500s, disease, violence, and social disruption helped unravel many Mississippian chiefdoms across the southeast. Etowah was eventually abandoned, but the mounds stayed behind. Adena Mound Builders Disappearance. The term mound builders sounds like the name of one vanished civilization, but it is really a broad label for many native cultures that built mounds and earthworks across eastern North America over thousands of years. In the Ohio River Valley and surrounding Appalachians, the Adena and Hopewell traditions raised burial mounds, geometric enclosures, ceremonial spaces, and earthworks that still shape the landscape today. Later, four ancient and Mississippian peoples built their own towns, plazas, platform mounds, and fortified settlements. These were not the work of a lost race. They were the achievements of indigenous societies with deep ties to the land. So, why do people say the mound builders disappeared? Well, the answer depends on which mound building culture is being discussed. Some traditions faded gradually as ceremonies changed. Others were absorbed into new ways of life. The Hopewell world, with its vast exchange networks, which we just talked about, and ceremonial centers, declined after about 400 AD for reasons still debated. Communities became more local, fewer large ritual earthworks were built, and the older patterns of trade and ceremony broke apart. Later mound building societies faced other pressures. Climate shifts could have damaged crops. Conflict may have pushed villages into more defensive locations. In some areas, people moved, reorganized, or became part of later native nations. Then, European contact, disease, warfare, displacement, and colonial expansion devastated indigenous populations across the continent, breaking many lines of memory between older mound sites and the communities later encountered by settlers, which created one of America's most persistent myths. In the 1800s, many white settlers refused to believe native peoples had built the mounds. They imagined vanished races, lost tribes, Welsh princes, giants, or other outsiders. The myth served a purpose. It made native people seem disconnected from the land and easier to remove. Archaeology eventually proved the truth. The mounds were Native American creations, but the mound builders did not vanish into thin air. Their societies just changed, fractured, migrated, and endured through their descendants. The birth of Cherokee country. The Cherokee did not emerge from a single moment in history. Their origins reach back through oral tradition, archaeology, language, and the older mound building world of the southern Appalachians. Cherokee tradition preserves memories of movement from the Great Lakes region, and the Cherokee language belongs to the Iroquoian language family, linking it distantly to peoples further north. But by the time Europeans entered the southeast, the Cherokee homeland was firmly rooted in the mountains of western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, northern Georgia, and northwestern South Carolina. Archaeologists often connect the ancestors of the historic Cherokee with the later South Appalachian Mississippian world, including the Pisgah and Qualla phases. These communities lived in stockaded towns, farmed corn, beans, and squash, built council houses and platform mounds, and organized life around plazas, clans, ceremonies, and river valleys. In places like western North Carolina, older Mississippian patterns did not simply vanish. They changed, blended, and continued into the Cherokee towns known to later history. The arrival of Europeans brought disruption on a scale that reshaped the entire southeast. Spanish expeditions moved through the region in the 1500s, carrying violence, disease, and instability. Later English trade brought guns, metal tools, cloth, and new alliances, but also war, debt, land pressure, and dependency. Cherokee towns dealt with the British as both trading partners and enemies, fighting, negotiating, and adapting as colonial power expanded around them. By the 1700s, the Cherokee were one of the strongest native nations in the southeast. Their towns were divided into regional groups, including the Overhill, Middle, Valley, Out, and Lower towns. They hunted, farmed, traded deerskins, raised family through clan networks, and made political decisions through local town councils rather than one single centralized government. In the early United States, the Cherokee adopted some Euro-American tools and institutions, while fighting to preserve sovereignty over their homeland, but treaties, settler expansion, and the Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced a crisis that became the Trail of Tears. Glowing forest of the Smokies. After sunset in the Great Smoky Mountains, the forest becomes stranger than it first appears. Some of its light is obvious. Fireflies rise from the leaf litter and flash between the trees, using their glow to find mates in the dark. The Smokies are home to at least 19 species of fireflies, each with its own timing, habitat, and pattern. The most famous is the synchronous firefly, whose males flash in rhythm near Elkmont, filling the woods with pulses of greenish yellow light followed by sudden darkness. But fireflies are only part of the hidden glow. In rotting logs and damp forest floors, certain fungi produce a cold green light known as foxfire. The glow comes from bioluminescence, the same general kind of chemical light used by fireflies. Old stories treated foxfire as something paranormal, fairy fire, false fire, or a ghost light. Some observers claimed it was bright enough to read by. Scientists still debate exactly why the fungi glows, but one theory is that the light attracts insects, helping spread spores throughout the forest. There is also another kind of glow, biofluorescence. These organisms do not make their own light. Instead, they absorb light from sources like the moon or ultraviolet lamps and re-emit it in different colors. Under a black light, lichens can flare purple, green, or orange against the bark. Salamanders, millipedes, insects, birds, plants, and even flying squirrels can reveal colors invisible to the human eye in daylight. Together, these glowing organisms turn the Smokies into a second landscape after dark. One is what we see in the sunlight, the other waits until night, hides in the moss, bark, wings, and rotting wood. Blue people of Troublesome Creek. In the hills of eastern Kentucky, near Troublesome Creek and Ball Creek, one Appalachian family became known for a condition that sounded almost impossible. They were called the Blue Fugates, or Blue People of Kentucky. The story begins around 1820, when Martin Fugate settled near Hazard, Kentucky, and married Elizabeth Smith. By chance, both carried the same rare recessive gene linked to a blood disorder called methemoglobinemia. Their children could inherit the condition only if they received the gene from both parents. 4 of Martin and Elizabeth's children were said to have been born with blue skin. In the remote mountain communities of the 1800s, travel was difficult, roads were few, railroads had not reached the area, and families often married within a small local circle. Over generations, the Fugates intermarried with nearby families such as the Smiths, Richies, Combs, and Stacys. The gene remained in the local population, and more blue-skinned descendants appeared in the hollows of eastern Kentucky. The condition did not mean their blood was literally blue, though. With this condition, the body has trouble converting methemoglobin back into normal hemoglobin, which carries oxygen through the blood. The result can make the blood look chocolate brown and the skin appear purple or blue, especially around the lips and fingernails. Many of the affected were otherwise healthy and lived long lives. For decades, people guessed at the cause. Some blamed heart disease, lung problems, or strange mountain folklore. The medical answer came in the 1960s when hematologist Dr. Madison Cawan III traveled into eastern Kentucky with nurse Ruth Pendergrass. After studying the family, they traced the condition to an enzyme deficiency and treated some affected descendants with methylene blue. Strangely enough, the blue medicine helped turn their skin pink. One of the last widely known cases came in 1975 when Benjamin Stacy was born with a deep blue-purple tint. His color faded as he grew older, though his lips and fingertips reportedly still turned blue when he was cold or upset. Tennessee Valley Abductors. In April of 1975, a man named John Womack was driving along a country road near Rhine Mountain in the Tennessee Valley of North Alabama when something impossible dropped out of the sky. He described it as a ball of fire about 3 feet across, falling through the trees and landing in the road just ahead of his car. Instead of burning out or rolling randomly, it moved down the gravel road As if it knew where it was going, Womack followed it as it turned, crossed a narrow bridge, moved into a meadow near a creek, and then rose into the air with a blowtorch-like roar. Then came the larger object. Womack claimed a huge silver disc appeared above the trees, surrounded by a yellow-blue glow. A column of strange light descended from it, spreading across the ground like mist or liquid. When he tried to retreat to his car, a red beam struck him in the face. The next thing he remembered, he was inside the craft, seated in a padded chair with a gold-colored helmet attached to his head. What followed became one of the strangest abduction accounts of the 1970s. Womack described meeting a leader-like being who communicated through a small translation device. He also claimed to see crab-like humanoids, hairy giants rescued from a dying world, and a massive living plant with long black arms kept aboard the ship to help produce oxygen. The beings reportedly spoke of inhabited planets, psychic powers, dying suns, solar energy, and the dangers of humanity's violence and selfishness. They claimed they had studied the Earth for thousands of years, but could not directly interfere with human development. Before the encounter ended, Womack was placed inside a cone-shaped machine and shown what appeared to be a journey through another solar system, multicolored worlds, icy outer planets, blue oceans, pink sands, and a colossal sun burning with rainbow-colored fire. He later awoke beneath a tree near the creek, with the craft still hovering nearby before it shot away at incredible speed. Womack would publish the story in a small 18-page book entitled "I Was Picked Up by a UFO," one of the strangest Appalachian UFO tales. The Stanford Abduction. January 6, 1976, Mona Stanford was celebrating her 36th birthday with two friends, Louise Smith and Elaine Thomas. The three women had driven from Liberty, Kentucky to the Redwoods restaurant near Stanford for a late dinner. None of them had been drinking, and around 11:15 that night, they headed home in Louise's 1967 Chevy Nova. Just outside Stanford, they saw a bright red object descending in the sky. At first, Mona thought it was a plane on fire, but as it dropped closer, the women realized it was something much larger, a huge metallic disc, described as bigger than two houses, with a dome, red lights around its middle, and other lights beneath it. The object hovered near the road, rocked back and forth, then moved away. Moments later, a blue light appeared through the rear window. The object had circled behind them. Suddenly, Louise lost control of the car. The Chevy accelerated to 85 miles per hour. Even though her foot was no longer on the gas, the dashboard indicated the engine had stalled. Yet, the car kept racing forward. The women felt burning in their eyes, then saw what looked like a strange wide road up ahead. The next thing they knew, they were near Houstonville, 8 miles from where the encounter began. Roughly an hour and 20 minutes had vanished. When they reached Louise's home around 1:25 a.m., all three were shaken up. They had irritated eyes, intense thirst, and red burn-like marks on the back of their necks. Louise's watch reportedly began spinning at an abnormal speed, and her car developed electrical problems, and her pet parakeet became terrified of her before dying weeks later. The case drew attention from the Mutual UFO Network and the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization and Dr. J. Allen Hynek's circle. Under hypnosis with Dr. R. Leo Sprinkle, the women described being taken from a car and examined by small shadowy beings with large eyes, gray skin, and surgical-looking garments. In July 1976, all three also passed polygraph tests administered by a Lexington detective. What really happened is still unknown, but it remains one of Appalachia's most unsettling UFO stories. Wytheville Sightings. Fall 1987, the quiet mountain town of Wytheville, Virginia, became the center of one of the strangest UFO waves in Appalachian history. It began on October 7th when WYVE radio reporter Danny Gordon checked in with Wythe County Sheriff Wayne Pike for the morning crime report. Pike told him something unusual. Several local police officers had seen strange red and green lights over Fort Chiswell. Some of the officers had military experience, making their story harder to dismiss. Gordon aired the report almost like a novelty piece, but then the calls started. Residents from Wytheville and the surrounding county began flooding the local radio station with their own sightings. People described silent objects drifting low over their homes, strange lights moving in patterns, dome-shaped craft, triangles, spheres, and other shapes that did not match ordinary aircraft. Some witnesses said the object hovered without sound. Others said they moved in ways that seemed impossible. At first, Gordon suspected some kind of military exercise or experimental aircraft, but official explanations did not satisfy the reports. Refueling planes was also suggested, but many sightings involved silent, low-flying objects hovering close to the ground. Then, Gordon saw something himself. On October 21st, he and his friend, Roger Hall, drove through the area where many of the sightings had been reported. They later described a large wingless dome-shaped craft with a strobe-like light and a smaller red sphere that appeared to move toward it and dock with it. The next night, they returned with cameras and took photographs. By the end of 1987, reports had climbed into the hundreds, and eventually, more than 1,500 sightings were associated with the Wytheville wave. The attention brought reporters, investigators, and eventually, an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, but it also brought pressure. Gordon reported anonymous warnings, a breaking into his home, strange visitors claiming to be journalists, and missing photo negatives. No single explanation has ever closed the case. Whether it was military technology, mass hallucination, or something stranger, this story has forever linked Wytheville with UFOs. John Hendricks, prophet of Oak Ridge. Long before Oak Ridge became the Secret City, the land was quiet farmland in Anderson County, Tennessee. But local legend says one man saw what was coming decades before anyone else. His name was John Hendricks. Born in 1865, Hendricks lived a troubled life. After the death of his young daughter, Ethel, his first wife, Julia, left him and took their remaining children to Arkansas. Some later accounts suggest the family tragedy was tied to the accusations that Hendricks had been harsh with the child before she became ill. Whatever the truth, the loss seems to have broken him. Hendricks wandered into the woods, praying for answers. As the story goes, he heard a voice telling him to sleep on the ground for 40 nights, and if he obeyed, he would be shown the future of Bear Creek Valley. When he emerged, he began telling neighbors about visions that sounded impossible at the time. He said Bear Creek Valley would one day be filled with great buildings and factories. He said those factories would help win the greatest war the world had ever seen. He spoke of a city rising on Black Oak Ridge, of a railroad spur branching from the main line, of big engines digging ditches, and of thousands of people running back and forth amid noise, confusion, and shaking earth. To the people around him, it sounded like madness. Hendricks was eventually confined at the Anderson County Poor Farm, though family stories say he escaped and predicted that God would punish the place. In 1901, lightning reportedly struck the building. He would die of tuberculosis in 1915, long before the Manhattan Project transformed the valley. But in 1942, the federal government seized roughly 60,000 acres around Oak Ridge. Within a few years, a secret city, massive factories, rail lines, and tens of thousands of workers had appeared almost exactly where Hendricks had described them. Skeptics point out, though, that the prophecy was not written down until after the fact, but in East Tennessee, John Hendricks remains the prophet of Oak Ridge. Appalachia's Lost States. Before Tennessee and Kentucky fully took shape, the Appalachian frontier was filled with borders that had yet not hardened, and a few ambitious communities tried to turn that uncertainty into new governments. One of the most famous was the lost state of Franklin. In 1874, settlers in what is now northeastern Tennessee felt abandoned by North Carolina's government in the east. When North Carolina briefly voted to cede its western lands to the federal government, frontier leaders saw an opening. They met at Jonesboro, declared their own state, elected John Sevier as governor, created courts, collected taxes, and tried to govern themselves, but Congress never admitted Franklin to the Union, and North Carolina soon reclaimed the territory. For a few years, two rival governments operated in the same mountains until the movement collapsed after violence between Franklin supporters and North Carolina loyalists. By 1796, the land became part of Tennessee. During the Civil War, another mountain rebellion took shape in Scott County, Tennessee. East Tennessee had strong Unionist sympathies, and Scott County overwhelmingly rejected secession. If Tennessee could leave the United States, local leaders argued, then Scott County could leave Tennessee. In 1861, they declared themselves the free and independent state of Scott. It was never legally recognized, but the symbolism mattered. Scott County became a Unionist pocket in Confederate Tennessee, suffering raids, violence, and occupation. Strangely, the county did not formally repeal its symbolic secession until 1986. Even earlier, in 1775, land speculator Richard Henderson dreamed of creating a private 14th colony called Transylvania, meaning across the woods. Through the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals, his company claimed a vast tract of what is now Kentucky and Tennessee, then hired Daniel Boone to help cut the wilderness road through Cumberland Gap. For a brief moment, Boonesboro was imagined as the capital of a new colony, but Virginia and North Carolina rejected the deal, and Cherokee resistance, especially from dragging canoe, made the claim even more unstable. By the 1780s, Transylvania had vanished. Richard Clayton's balloon voyage. In April of 1835, long before airplanes crossed the sky, a Cincinnati watchmaker and silversmith named Richard Clayton climbed into a balloon called the Star of the West and attempted one of the boldest flights in early American aviation. Clayton was not just an inventor, he was a showman. Crowds paid to watch his grand aerial voyage, and when the balloon rose from a Court Street amphitheater in Cincinnati, he carried a strange companion with him, a small dog. At about a mile high, Clayton released the animal with a parachute, and the dog reportedly floated safely back to Earth. Clayton, though, kept going. For 9.5 hours, the Star of the West drifted eastward, crossing roughly 350 miles. His goal may have been to ride the winds all the way back toward the Atlantic, but instead, the balloon carried him into the rugged Allegheny backcountry of what was then Monroe County, Virginia, and is now part of West Virginia. At around 2:30 in the morning, the balloon struck a tree on a steep ridge, leaving Clayton suspended high above the ground. Rather than risk climbing down in the dark, he tied off the basket and waited until dawn. When morning came, he found himself in a remote mountain landscape with no obvious sign of roads, towns, or people. Eventually, Clayton found help from local residents, including the family of Joseph Graham. The Grahams took him in, and the neighbors helped him search for the damaged balloon. Word spread quickly that a man had fallen from the sky, and curious people came from miles around to see both Clayton and the strange craft that had brought him there. After the balloon was recovered, Clayton hauled the remains back toward the Ohio River and returned to Cincinnati by steamboat, where he was greeted as a hero. Decades later, when a post office was established near the Graham home, the community was named Clayton in his honor. Octavia Hatcher. In Pikeville, Kentucky, one of the town's most famous graves belongs to Octavia Hatcher, a young woman whose story sits somewhere between tragedy, folklore, and one of the oldest human fears. Octavia married James Hatcher in 1889. He was one of Pikeville's most successful businessmen, involved in timber, coal, land, and the Hotel Hatcher. Their marriage was short and marked by grief, because in early 1891, Octavia gave birth to a son, Jacob, who died only a short time later. After the loss of her baby, Octavia fell into a deep depression. Over the next few months, she became bedridden, slipped into a coma-like state, and was pronounced dead on May 2, 1891. Because the weather was unusually hot and embalming was not yet common in the area, she was buried quickly in the Hatcher family plot at Pikeville Cemetery. Then, the story takes a horrifying turn. Several days later, other people in Pikeville reportedly began showing similar symptoms. They too fell into death-like comas, but unlike Octavia, some of them eventually woke up. Local legend blamed a strange sleeping sickness, sometimes said to have been caused by the bite of a fly. Fearing the impossible, James Hatcher ordered Octavia's body exhumed. When the coffin was open, the legend says the lining had been torn, her fingernails were bloody, and her face was frozen in terror. Octavia, according to the story, had not been dead when she was buried. No surviving newspaper account has confirmed the exhumation, and skeptics argue that the tale may have grown from James Hatcher's own fear of premature burial. He later kept a specially designed coffin for himself, reportedly built to allow escape if he were ever buried alive. Still, the legend endured. James had a life-size monument of Octavia placed over her grave, originally showing her holding baby Jacob. Vandals later broke off the arm holding the child, and stories spread that the statue moved, cried, or turned away from Pikeville on the anniversary of her death. As to whether Octavia Hatcher was truly buried alive, we may never know the real answer. The legend of Solly. In the mountains of western North Carolina, the story of Solly stands between history, legend, and survival. Solly, also known as Charlie, was a Cherokee farmer who lived near the mouth of the Nantahala River in 1838 during the forced removal of the Cherokee people. While thousands were being rounded up and marched west on what would become the Trail of Tears, many Cherokee in the North Carolina mountains refused to leave, some hid in the woods, hoping the army would pass them by. Solly was among them. In late 1838, soldiers captured him, his wife, his sons, his brother, and other family members somewhere near the Tuckasegee River. The traditional Cherokee account says the captives were treated brutally, and that Solly's wife was prodded with bayonets when she could not move fast enough. Speaking in Cherokee, he urged the others to resist. In the struggle that followed, soldiers were killed or wounded, and the Cherokee escaped into the mountains. General Winfield Scott ordered that the fugitives be hunted down. William Holland Thomas, a white attorney and ally of the Cherokee, became involved in the search, trying to protect the Cherokee who had legal claims to remain in North Carolina. A former neighbor of Solly, known as Ukela or Utsala, helped lead Cherokee men in the pursuit. This is where the legend and the records begin to split, and the story passed down among the Cherokee. Solly learned that if he surrendered, the remaining Cherokee hiding in the mountains would be allowed to stay, so he gave himself up and accepted execution as a sacrifice for his people. Military records tell a harsher, more complicated version. They suggest Solly did not voluntarily surrender, but was captured after others in his group had already been executed. Some records even suggest that officers were uncertain whether Solly himself had killed anyone, but either way, he was executed in November 1838. Afterward, some Cherokee were allowed to remain in western North Carolina, forming part of the community that would later become the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Whether he was a martyr, fugitive, or both, he would become a symbol of the Cherokee who refused to let removal be the final word. The alleged Yahoo Falls Massacre. Yahoo Falls is one of the most beautiful places in southeastern Kentucky, and one of the most contested. Hidden in what is now the Big South Fork region of the Daniel Boone National Forest, the waterfall drops more than 100 feet into a quiet rock shelter below. Today, hikers come for the scenery, the mist, and the sound of water echoing off stone. But tied to this place is a much darker story, the alleged massacre at Yahoo Falls, sometimes called the Great Cherokee Children Massacre. The legend says that on August 10, 1810, Cherokee women and children from the Cumberland River Valley gathered beneath the falls. They were supposedly preparing to travel south to a school that connected with Reverend Gideon Blackburn, where they hoped the children would find safety and education. Their protection was said to be arranged by Corn Blossom, a figure described in the story as daughter of the Cherokee leader Doublehead. But before the group could leave, armed men allegedly arrived at the falls. In the most dramatic versions, they were led by a local Indian fighter named Hiram Big Tooth Gregory, sometimes connected to the violent legacy of John Severe's frontier campaigns. The Cherokee that had gathered beneath the rock house were trapped in the open shelter, and the story claims that more than 100 women and children were killed there. For generations, the tale has been repeated in family histories, local lore, and Cherokee oral tradition. A related story says the human bones were once exposed behind the falls after logging damaged the surrounding soil, leaving behind an empty trench where a mass grave had been. But this is where the story becomes difficult. Historians have pointed out there is no solid contemporary record proving the massacre occurred. The best known written versions trace back to a family manuscript and later retellings. Even the figure of Princess Cornblossom is debated, since Cherokee society did not use that title, and early records do not clearly confirm her existence. An unofficial monument placed near the site in 2006 was later removed by Forest Service officials, in part because they questioned whether the event could be documented. To this day, the story sits somewhere between history and legend. The Mad Butcher of Fayette County. Between 1962 and 1964, a strange fear settled over southern West Virginia. Around Oak Hill, Fayette County, and nearby Wyoming County, men began disappearing. Some were last seen walking alone, others were believed to have been hitchhiking, a common way to get around the coal fields at the time. Soon, rumor gave the unknown killer a name, the Mad Butcher of West Virginia. The case became a public terror after the death of Mike Rogers, a young man from Oak Hill whose dismembered remains were found near Gauley Mountain in December 1962. The discovery was so disturbing that stories spread almost immediately. Stories of a body cut apart with precision, of remains hidden in a bag, and of a killer who might have known how to butcher animals. But Rogers was only one name tied to the legend. Ernest Gwynn, a 76-year-old retired railroad worker, disappeared in July 1962 after reportedly receiving his pension check. Sammy Smith vanished that October after stopping near Oak Hill. Shirley Jean Arthur, a Navy man reported AWOL, disappeared in 1963, around the same time that a headless torso was found near Pineville. Lou Bennett, James Lee Haynes, and others were also folded into the growing fear. By 1964, newspapers were asking whether a Mad Butcher was stalking the region, but the truth was never that clean. Some investigators believed there was no single killer at all, only a cluster of disappearances and unsolved murders linked together by panic, geography, and rumor. George Bragg, who later wrote about West Virginia unsolved murders, noted that while several men disappeared in the same general period, only a few bodies could even possibly be tied to the so-called butcher. No one was ever convicted. That uncertainty is what kept the story alive. Maybe Oak Hill had a serial killer who hunted isolated men in the early 1960s. Maybe the butcher was a legend built from separate crimes in a frightened coalfield community. The Ghost of Mimi Thurman. In Logan County, West Virginia, the ghost story of Mimi Thurman begins with a real murder. Mimi was a stylish dark-haired woman in her early 30s, married to Logan police officer Jack Thurman. By 1932, the couple lived in a small apartment behind the home of Harry Robertson, a local banker and prominent businessman. Robertson's handyman and chauffeur, Clarence Stevenson, also lived on the property. On the night of June 21st, 1932, Mimi was seen in Logan wearing a blue polka dot dress. The next day, Garland Davis, a young deaf man, was picking blackberries on Trace Mountain and found her body near what locals now call 22 Mine Road. The crime was brutal. She had been shot, had her throat cut, and her body had been left in the weeds beside the mountain road. Robbery did not seem to be the motive. Her purse, money, jewelry, and watch were all found nearby. Suspicion quickly fell on Harry Robertson and Clarence Stevenson. Bloodstains were reportedly found in Robertson's home and car, and Robertson admitted he had been having an affair with Mimi, but Robertson was never indicted. Instead, Stevenson a black candy man in a deeply unequal coalfield society, was tried, convicted, and sent to prison. From the beginning, many people questioned whether the right man had been punished. Later writers, relatives, and researchers pointed to rumors involving powerful men in Logan, political pressure, racial bias, and the possibility that Stevenson had been used as a convenient scapegoat. That uncertainty never went away. Neither did Mimi. Local legend says her spirit still haunts 22 Mine Road, near the place where her body was found. Drivers have reported seeing a woman in an old-fashioned dress walking along the roadside, sometimes appearing through the fog before vanishing. Others say if you stop your car near the hill, the vehicle will roll uphill, pushed by unseen hands. Skeptics call it Gravity Hill. Locals call it Mimi. Booger Hole. In northern Clay County, West Virginia, there is a hollow with a name that sounds almost comical until you learn what happened there. Booger Hole. In old Appalachian speech, booger meant something closer to a boogeyman, a thing in the dark, and for a time, that name seemed to fit. Booger Hole sits in the Rush Fork Valley near Big Otter and Ivydale, a remote place where, from the late 1800s into the early 1900s, a string of murders and disappearances became local legend. The exact number of victims is unknown. Some accounts say 6 or 8, others say nearly a dozen, but the names that survived are grim enough. Andrew Hargis disappeared while traveling through the area, reportedly carrying a large sum of money. Joseph Clark, a watchmaker or clock repairman, slept one night in the local schoolhouse and vanished, leaving only a trail of blood leading toward the creek. An older woman named Lacey Ann Boggs was shot through a window, with some neighbors claiming she was a witch, while others believed she simply knew too much about the murders. Then, in 1917, Preston Tanner was found dead after his cabin burned. His death finally brought a special grand jury to Clay County, and suspicion fell on Andrew Sampson and his son Howard. A mob formed outside the jail, demanding justice before the trial could ever happen. When the courts did not satisfy the people of the Holler, the so-called Clay County mob posted warnings on trees and fence posts, threatening suspected families and ordering them to leave the state. Some homes were even dynamited or burned. After that, the violence seemed to fade, but the stories did not. Locals spoke of ghostly riders heard coming up the road, though no one appeared. Others told of a woman in white with long black hair walking the paths and wailing in the dark. There were stories of crying babies, vanishing dogs, and old houses no one wanted to sleep in. Today, Booger Hole is quiet, with homes and farms where the old fear once lived, but the name remains. A reminder that sometimes the boogeyman was not in the woods. Sometimes he just lived down the road. Tennessee Wildman. The Tennessee Wildman is one of those Appalachian stories that is a mix between Bigfoot, feral man folklore, and old newspaper panic. The story reaches back to the 1800s, with some of the earliest tales placing the creature in McNairy County, Tennessee. In one version, the wild man is captured by a traveling sideshow and displayed in a cage until it finally broke loose and vanished back into the mountains. In others, he was never a captured beast at all, but something already living in the Tennessee woods, just beyond the reach of towns, roads, and farms. Descriptions vary, but the core image stays mostly the same: a towering, human-like figure covered in dark gray, brown, or reddish hair, standing anywhere from 7 feet to 9 feet tall. Unlike many Bigfoot reports, the Tennessee Wildman is often described as more than ape, with a face that eerily seems human. Witnesses speak of piercing red eyes, a horrible rotting odor, and a scream so violent and unnatural that it seems to empty the forest around it. The behavior is what separates him from the more familiar Sasquatch legends. Bigfoot is usually portrayed as elusive, slipping away from human contact. The Wildman is said to be territorial, aggressive, and sometimes openly hostile. Old stories claim he chased dogs, disturbed livestock, stalked homes near the woods, and had a strange fixation on women, though the alleged attacks never seemed to end in confirmed injuries. Over time, groups of men were said to have gone searching for him, only to find nothing, or to come back badly shaken by whatever they heard in the dark. One of the better-known modern accounts comes from the Elizabethton area. In the 1990s, Rob Phillips and a companion were near Bee Cliffs when the woods suddenly went silent. Then came the snap of a twig, followed by an inhuman scream. As the men fled through the rain and darkness, Phillips later claimed he saw the creature clinging to a nearby tree, only about 15 feet away. He described it as massive, dark orange, foul-smelling, with red eyes and claw-like hands. Whether that was a cryptid, a misidentified animal, a person living in the woods, or just a legend becoming more modern, the Tennessee Wildman remains one of Appalachian's stranger backwood figures. Not quite Bigfoot, not quite human. Appalachian Dog Beast. Across Appalachia, one of the strangest recurring cryptid traditions is the story of the dog beast, something canine, but not quite a dog, not quite a wolf, and not always fully animal. Modern witnesses often describe what has become called Dogman as a tall, upright creature with a long muzzle, pointed ears, dark fur, and glowing eyes. It is usually seen where the woods press close to human life, on back roads, near farms, along hunting land, or just beyond the tree line behind a house. Again and again, the same detail appears in the stories. It is not just passing through, it seems to be watching. Other regional legends echo that same shape. In the Catoctin Mountains of western Maryland, folklore tells of the Dueo, a black-haired, wolf-like creature said to stand upright and move with disturbing power. Its story first spread through a bizarre 1965 report to a local newspaper, then grew through later sightings, screams in the woods, and rumors of a beast tied to older Maryland monster lore. Further south, Alabama has its own variation with the White Thing. Unlike the darker dog beast stories, this one appears pale, sometimes described as a ghostly wolf, sometimes a white cat, sometimes a strange humanoid moving low and fast through the brush. The details change depending on the witness, but the feeling remains the same. Something large, pale, and deeply wrong moving through the dark. Tennessee contributes another branch of the tradition with the ghost dog, a black canine apparition said to appear on lonely roads and rural properties. Unlike some cryptid stories, this one feels closer to a haunting. A hostile black dog that growls, circles, appears in headlights, and sometimes seems to vanish as suddenly as it came. And in Valley Crucis, North Carolina, the legend becomes even more sinister. There, near the old churchyard, stories tell of a massive black demon dog with red, burning eyes that chases drivers down the mountain road but will not cross the water near the valley's famous intersecting streams. Skeptics, though, point to bears, stray dogs, coyotes, escaped animals, and fear just working on the imagination. Cat of Many Colors. The Cat of Many Colors is one of Tennessee's stranger and more obscure cat legends. Not a Black Panther, not a Wampus cat, and not quite like anything else in Appalachian folklore. The story comes out of Jackson County, Tennessee, around 1996. A group of hunters allegedly shot a large, unfamiliar feline, but instead of reporting it, they kept it quiet out of fear they might get into trouble for killing a protected or illegal animal. The carcass was supposedly skinned, and the pelt was hidden away in a basement. What made the animal so unusual was its coloring. The creature was described as cheetah-like in shape, with a golden brown body marked with black stripes and spots. Its head and paws were said to be blood red, with a red stripe running down the back from the head to the tail. That gave rise to the name the Cat of Many Colors, sometimes called the Tennessee Multicolored Cat. The case became even more frustrating because there was allegedly a photograph. A man named Brian Long claimed to have seen it, but the photo was later sold to a biology student, and after that, its trail disappeared. No confirmed image, no pelt, and no physical specimen has ever publicly surfaced. That leaves the cat of many colors in the same uncomfortable place as many cryptid stories, detailed enough to be memorable, but missing that one piece of evidence that would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was real. Several possible explanations have been suggested. It may have been a misidentified exotic cat, like a jaguar, or a jaguarundi, though none of those fit the description perfectly. Jaguars have spots, but not red heads and paws. Jaguarundis have a reddish color, but they are not patterned like that. Another possibility is that the red areas were not natural fur at all, but dried blood from the animal's death or from a recent kill. Some have compared it to a mutated mountain lion, since young cougars have spots that normally fade as they mature. A rare adult retaining unusual markings could create this exact cryptid story here, especially in a place where large cats were already surrounded by rumor. Whatever it was, the cat of many colors remains a ghost of a cryptid, shot, skinned, photographed, and then somehow lost in someone's basement. Beast of Beckley. The Beast of Beckley is one of West Virginia's lesser-known cryptids, but the story behind it is unusually specific. The main account centers on a witness named Raven, who described years of encounters around the woods near Beckley. The first incident reportedly happened around 2001 or 2002, when Raven's younger brother came home terrified after playing near their grandparents' property. He claimed he had seen something black, taller than their father, who stood about 6'4", with sharp teeth, yellow eyes, and what looked like a smile. At first, the family thought he had seen a bear, but a few years later, Raven and a friend went toward the edge of the woods after dark, curious about the old story. Raven stopped near some chestnut trees while the friend continued toward a small clearing. That was when Raven noticed a crouched black shape in the brush, not with two eyes, but four, glowing a yellow or amber color. When the friend ran back and slipped in the mud nearby, both of them saw it. Raven picked up a branch and stepped toward it, and the thing answered with a roar unlike anything they had ever heard. The next day, they found deep gashes in the trees around the spot, as if something with large claws had torn into the bark. After that, the sightings continued for years. The creature was finally seen at a distance, staying just beyond the light, its body mostly lost in the dark, except for four yellow eyes. Raven described it as a tall, thickly built, and almost impossibly black humanoid shadow standing where no shadow should be. The clearest sighting came in November of 2011, after Raven returned home around 3 in the morning. From the dining room window, Raven saw the creature outside the fence, near the family truck. It seemed to tower above the vehicle, staring through the glass before suddenly running toward the woods with an unnatural speed. Only afterward did Raven realize he must have been close when they had pulled into the driveway. In 2015, Raven moved away and the encounters stopped. But on the family's old property, reports of strange sounds apparently continued. And by 2019, there were reports of strange lights in the woods, screeches in the night, and the sense that something was out there. The Beast of Beckley is not a famous monster, but it is one of Appalachia's most obscure and strange cryptids. Veggie Man. West Virginia already has more than its share of strange cryptids. Mothman, the Flatwoods monster, and the Grafton monster have already been touched upon in this iceberg, but one of the strangest is one of the least known, the Vegetable Man. The story begins in July of 1968 near Granttown, not far from Fairmont, West Virginia. A local man named Jennings Frederick was out hunting groundhogs when he heard a bizarre sound in the woods. He described it as like a recording being played too fast, a high-pitched, jabbering voice coming from somewhere nearby. Then, somehow, he began to understand it. The voice told him not to be afraid. It said it came in peace. It said it needed medical assistance. It needed his help. That was when Frederick realized something had grabbed him. Wrapped around his wrist was what looked like a thin, flexible arm attached to a creature roughly 7 feet tall. It had a semi-human shape, but its body seemed plant-like. with narrow, reed-like arms, pointed ears, and yellow eyes. Its hands were even stranger. 3 long fingers, each tip with suction cups and needle-like thorns. Frederick first thought he had snagged himself on briars, but then the creature tightened its grip. The needle tips pierced his skin, and he heard a suction sound. He was drawing blood from his arm. As he struggled, the creature's eyes shifted from yellow to red, then seemed to rotate into glowing orange circles. Frederick said the effect was hypnotic. His fear faded. He could not move. For about a minute, he was held in the woods while this impossible thing fed from him. Then, just as suddenly, it released him. The vegetable man bounded up the hillside in enormous leaps, each one said to cover more than 20 feet. From beyond the hill, Frederick heard a humming and whistling sound, which he believed may have been some kind of craft taking off. He then went home, cleaned the wounds, and told his family he had been scratched by briars. The case did not surface publicly until years later, when it was written up by Gary Barker, a famous West Virginia UFO writer with a long reputation for hoaxes and exaggerations. That makes the story, well, difficult to trust. There was no investigation, no physical evidence, and no second sighting of the vegetable man has ever been reported. Ogawa River Monster. The Ogawa is one of West Virginia's oldest river cryptids, a creature said to haunt the Monongahela and its connected waters under several names: the Rivesville Monster, the Holt Monster, and the Monongahela River Monster. Most descriptions make it sound like a gigantic alligator snapping turtle, though some versions turn it into something stranger. It is said to be reddish-brown, heavily built, anywhere from 15 to 20 feet long, with a long tail, crushing jaws, and the ability to crawl from the water onto land. In some older accounts, the creature is said to have 2 heads. It is most often tied to the Monongahela River in Marion County, West Virginia, but the legend spreads through the Ohio, Allegheny, and nearby waterways. One of the oldest stories goes back to the mid-1700s near Holt, West Virginia. According to the legend, a 12-year-old boy from the Nichols family was fishing along the Monongahela River when something enormous rose from the water and dragged him under. He was never seen again. Not long after, the family reportedly heard something large rubbing against their cabin. Another early account came from the Fort Harmar area near present-day Marietta, Ohio, where a young man wrote of an amphibious creature that hid along deer paths at night. He was said to wait behind stumps, seize deer with a long tail, drag them into the water, and drown them. Men at the fort allegedly killed one of the beasts and claimed it weighed 444 pounds. The modern Ogawa legend became famous in 1983 when coal miner John Edward White was night fishing near Rivesville, where Pawpaw Creek meets the Monongahela, and he would notice small waves coming toward the shore, then saw fish scattering into the creek. Moments later, he claimed a huge fin rose above the water about 30 feet away. He backed up and caught a glimpse of a long reptilian tail sweeping through the river before the mass disappeared beneath the surface. After that night, he refused to fish there again. Skeptics have suggested alligator snapping turtles, escaped alligators, large fish, exaggeration, or just frontier legend. But the Ogawa survives because rivers are perfect places for monsters. They are dark, moving, and deep enough to hide what most people fear. Nobby. In northern Cleveland County, North Carolina, the local Bigfoot legend has a name: Nobby. The creature is tied to the wooded hills around Carpenter's Knob, named Casser, and the Cleveland-Lincoln County line. Sightings of a large, hairy ape-like figure were reported in the area as early as the 1960s, but Nobby became a full-blown local phenomenon in 1979 when residents around Toluca and Casser began claiming they had seen something moving through the yards, roadsides, and the surrounding woods. One of the earliest witnesses was Minnie Cook, an elderly woman who lived west of Toluca. Her encounter reportedly frightened her so badly that afterward, she carried a rifle whenever she left her home. Soon, other people began coming forward. They described a tall, heavy creature, sometimes over 6 feet, sometimes much larger, with a dark, flat face, and shaggy hair. Unlike the classic image of Bigfoot, Nobby was said to have light or blonde-colored fur. The sounds connected to the cryptid were just as unnerving as the sightings. Witnesses described screams, deep growls, strange yodeling noises, and a high, human-like cry that sounded almost like a woman in pain. Search parties were organized. A local radio station even sponsored a hunt, but despite tracks reportedly larger than a man's hand, and one farmer blaming Nobby for a goat found dead with a broken neck, no one could ever produce proof for the creature. For a while, the Nobby panic faded. Then, in 2010, the legend came roaring back. Around 3 in the morning, on June 5th, Tim Peeler called 911 from his remote home west of Kasser. His dogs had been barking, and when he stepped outside, he claimed he saw a huge, light-haired beast come out of the woods and approach his property. Peeler said it walked right past him, went toward his dogs, and stood nearly 10 feet tall. Armed with only a stick, he shouted at it, poked at it, and talked rough until the thing finally retreated back into the darkness. The 911 calls were released, and the story spread far beyond Cleveland County. Some laughed, some believed, and some locals, familiar with decades of sightings, were less amused than outsiders expected. Squonk. The squonk is one of the strangest creatures in American lumberjack folklore, not because it is dangerous, but because it is miserable. The legend comes from the hemlock forest of northern Pennsylvania, where lumbermen once traded stories about fearsome critters in the logging camps. They were strange, impossible animals said to inhabit the deep woods, half joke, half warning, and half campfire entertainment. The squonk first appeared in print in 1910 in William T. Cox's Fearsome Critters of the Lumberwoods. Unlike most cryptids, the squonk does not stalk people, attack livestock, or haunt lonely roads. It hides. It is described as an ugly little creature with loose, ill-fitting skin covered in warts, moles, and blemishes. It is so ashamed of its own appearance that it avoids being seen at all, moving mostly at twilight or dusk through the dark hemlocks. Wherever it goes, it weeps. Hunters are said to track it not by its footprints, but by the trail of tears it leaves behind on the forest floor. Its sadness is also its defense. According to the tale, if a squonk is cornered, frightened, or captured, it does not fight back. It simply dissolves into a puddle of its own tears. One story tells of a man named J.P. Wentling, who supposedly managed to lure a squonk into a sack by imitating its cries, and he carried it home, and the bag grew lighter and lighter, and when he opened it, it was gone. All that remained was liquid tears and bubbles where the poor animal had been. It is easy to see why the squonk survived its folklore. In a world of roaring beasts and sharp-clawed monsters, here was a creature built entirely out of loneliness. It was ridiculous, but also oddly human. A monster that did not want to scare anyone. A monster that only wanted to not be looked at. Coker Creek Gold. Long before the California Gold Rush, there was another gold district hidden in the mountains of East Tennessee. In the Coker Creek area of Monroe County, prospectors were already searching for the streams by 1827, back when the land was still within Cherokee Nation. The gold was not locked away in one massive mother lode. It was scattered through rivulets, gullies, low places, and upland creeks, where miners could wash the earth and gravel in hopes of finding flakes and nuggets. In 1831, Tennessee's first state geologist, Gerard Troost, visited Coker Creek and found hundreds of miners already working the area. Over the decades that followed, the search only grew. Prospectors, farmers, and mining companies all tried their luck, using everything from simple gold pans to hydraulic hoses, mechanical dredges, blasting, and tunnels carved into the hills. The peak came between 1856 and 1860, when as many as 600 to 700 prospectors were working around Coker Creek, including enslaved people and freedmen. A few men were said to have made fortunes, but for most, the gold brought only modest returns. Official U.S. Mint records counted no more than $422 worth of gold, found between 1831 and 1921. But local merchants who traded supplies directly for gold believed the real number was much higher, estimating that nearly 2 million had been taken from the region by the 1890s. Coker Creek eventually changed. The old gold fields gave way to logging, then to a quieter life built around mountain roads, hiking trails, waterfalls, fishing, and creek painting for tourists. But the history of the place runs much deeper than a roadside attraction. This was Cherokee land. The Unicoi Trail, which passed through the Coker Creek area, later became tied to the Trail of Tears, when thousands of Cherokee people were forced from the southeast. So the story of Coker Creek is not just about hidden Appalachian gold, it is also a story about what the gold helped unleash. Karst windows and lost rivers. Across Appalachia, some rivers do not stay on the surface. In karst country, water moves through a hidden world beneath the hills. Rain falls onto limestone, dolomite, or gypsum, then seeps into the cracks and fractures in the bedrock. Over thousands of years, the slightly acidic water dissolves the stone, widening tiny openings into conduits, caves, sinkholes, springs, and underground streams. One of the strangest features this creates is a karst window, sometimes called a karst Fenster. Fenster is the German word for window, and that is exactly what these places are, openings in the land where the roof of a subterranean stream has collapsed, briefly revealing a river that was never meant to be seen. A karst window can look almost impossible at first. Water may emerge from a spring, flow across the bottom of a sinkhole for only a short distance, and then vanish again into a swallow hole. To anyone standing above it, the scene feels like a river caught between two worlds, surfacing just long enough to prove the underground system exists before disappearing back into the darkness. Kentucky is one of the most famous karst regions in the world. Much of the state is underlain by rock capable of forming karst, and dozens of counties contain sinkholes, caves, springs, and sinking streams. Mammoth Cave alone contains hundreds of miles of surveyed passages, but it is only the most famous piece of a much larger underground landscape. In Pulaski County, Kentucky, Short Creek is recognized as a classic example. The small river appears and disappears in less than 350 feet, making it less like normal creek and more like a glimpse into the hidden plumbing of the earth. At Cedar Creek and Mammoth Cave National Park, surface streams and collapsed cave passages reveal the same strange pattern: water that rises, crosses open ground, and sinks away again. These places are not just geological curiosities. Karst aquifers supply drinking water, feed springs, and shape entire ecosystems, but they are also fragile. Because water moves so quickly through karst, pollution can travel underground with little natural filtration. What disappears into a sinkhole may reappear miles away in a spring. Great Channels of Virginia. High on Clinch Mountain in southwest Virginia, near the 4,208-foot summit of Middle Knob, there is a place that feels like it belongs in the desert southwest, not hidden in the forest of Appalachia. It is called the Great Channels of Virginia, a 20-acre maze of sandstone crevices, boulders, overhangs, and narrow passages tucked inside the channel's natural area preserve. From above, it looks like a fractured stone cap on top of the mountain, but once you climb down into it, the landscape changes completely. The forest disappears, the walls rise around you, the passages twist and split, some looping back on themselves, others ending suddenly in stone. The channels are part of a 721-acre natural area preserve within the larger Channel State Forest. The land was protected in 2008, recognized for its high elevation forest, cliff communities, rock outcrops, and one of the most unusual geological formations in Appalachia. The rock itself is ancient, roughly 400 million years old. Geologists believe the maze formed during the last ice age, when colder conditions, permafrost, and ice wedging slowly split the sandstone apart. Water entered cracks in the rock, froze, expanded, and forced the stone open over time. What was once a single sandstone cap became a labyrinth of slot canyon-like corridors. Inside the maze, it is easy to understand why visitors want each other to remember where they entered. The sandstone walls begin to look alike. The paths duck, squeeze, and turn through the rocks. Some hikers leave a backpack or marker at the entrance just to make sure they can find their way back out. Ghost in the mines. Deep in the old mining districts of Appalachia, not every sound underground was explained as shifting earth. Miners spoke of Tommyknockers, small mysterious beings said to live in the dark passages of the mines. In some versions, they were gnome-like creatures, only about 2 feet tall, with large heads, long arms, wrinkled faces, white whiskers, and tiny miners' clothes. In others, they were not creatures at all, but the ghosts of men who had died underground. The legend has roots in Cornish, Welsh, and other European mining folklore, where similar beings were known as knockers, buka, bucka, or burgeister, mountain ghosts, or little miners. Cornish miners helped carry the belief into America, especially after they began working in western Pennsylvania coal mines in the 1820s. From there, the stories followed miners into other coal and mining districts, spreading wherever men worked beneath the earth. The name came from the sound they were said to make. Deep inside a mine, workers might hear knocking in the walls or tapping in the distance. In practical terms, these sounds may have been timbers creaking, rock shifting, or the mine itself warning of stress before a collapse. But folklore gave the sound a presence. Some miners believed that Tommyknockers were dangerous, hammering at supports to bring the roof down. Others believed the opposite, that the knocking was a warning, a chance to run before the slate fell. To stay in their favor, miners sometimes left behind bits of food like the last bite of a pasty or a small offering from their lunch. Missing tools, stolen food, blown out lanterns, and strange noises could all be blamed on these little men underground. West Virginia's coalfields had their own ghost mining traditions. Old accounts tell of spirits lingering around after fatal accidents, phantom miners searching for tools, ghostly white mules caused by strange reflections, and even the spirit of a dead miner allegedly returning in the Pocahontas minefield to reveal that the wrong body had been buried under his name. The Wizard of South Mountain. On Smith Mountain in western Maryland, there was once a man people called the Wizard of South Mountain. His name was Michael Zittle Jr., born in 1798 near the mountain community that became known as Zittlestown, or not far from Boonesboro. He came from a German family, and in the 1800s, he became known across the region as a folk healer, conjurer, and keeper of a mysterious black book. To poor mountain families with few doctors and few options, Zittle was not a curiosity. He was someone you went to when nothing else worked. According to local tradition, he could stop bleeding with words, cure fevers, close wounds, ease the bite of a mad dog, dispel fear of the dark, and even compel thieves to return stolen property. One of his most famous cures was for what the locals called the go-backs, a wasting illness in children who failed to grow and seemed to weaken day by day. Whether his cures worked through faith, timing, suggestion, or something stranger, people from across South Mountain came to him believing he could help. His power was said to come from his conjuring book, written in German and later published in English as A Friend in Need or Secret Science. The book mixed folk healing, Christian language, charms, protective formulas, and old world magical traditions. To some, it was a healing manual. To others, it was dangerous occult work. Madeline Vinton Dahlgren, who collected South Mountain folklore in the late 1800s, saw Zittle much more darkly, calling him the center of the mountain's magical practices. Later writers were kinder, describing him as a faith healer shaped by the beliefs of Pennsylvania German folklore tradition rather than a sinister sorcerer. According to the legend, Zittle believed taking money for his cures would bring bad luck. For much of his life, he worked as a shingle maker and helped people without charging. But poverty wore him down. In 1845, he had his spell book translated and sold copies. The story says that once he tried to profit from his gift, his powers began to fade. He died poor in 1877, and for years, the Black Book was thought to be lost. Then copies surfaced again. including one found in a local home in the 1970s. Today, he is remembered as Appalachia's most famous mountain healer. Henry Shoemaker's Pennsylvania Lost Valley. In the mountains of central Pennsylvania, there is a legend that sounds like something pulled from an old adventure novel. Henry Wharton Shoemaker called it the Lost Valley. According to the story, this hidden valley lies somewhere near the upper tributaries of Lick Run, a mountain stream that flows into White Deer Creek in Union County. It is not a place someone simply finds on a map. Like the lost worlds of old fiction, it is said to reveal itself only by accident, usually to a hunter, hiker, or wanderer who has lost the trail. Shoemaker wrote that he went looking for the valley himself, drawn first by reports of a beaver killed near Lick Run in the early 1900s. Beavers had become rare in that part of Pennsylvania, and the discovery suggested a secluded, undisturbed place somewhere in the mountains. But the greater rumor was stranger. A local boy claimed that he looked out over a valley filled with wildlife from another age. The trees, he said, were blue with passenger pigeons, and the meadows were deer, elk, moose, wolves, panthers, and even woodland buffalo, animals that had vanished or nearly vanished from Pennsylvania long before. The most famous version of this legend centers on a young woman named Hazel Hawk. After wandering too far while gathering chestnuts, Hazel lost the trail at dusk and stumbled onto a beaver pond surrounded by huge gum trees. Beyond it, she found a fog-covered valley. She slept nearby, and when morning came, the fog lifted. Below her was a hidden wilderness. Waterfalls spilled from the cliffs, beaver pools shone between meadows, great white pines rose from the valley floor. Hawks, eagles, Carolina parakeets, and countless birds moved through the trees. Animals long gone from the mountains wandered as if time had never touched them. Hazel watched the valley for 2 days before finding her way back. Searchers eventually discovered her near Lick Run, but when others tried to retrace her steps, the valley could not be found. Shoemaker's folklore is often questioned, and the Lost Valley may be more fiction than record. The Hart brothers in the Cumberland Gap region. In the late 1700s, the Wilderness Road was already a dangerous path through the Appalachian frontier. It passed through the Cumberland Gap and into Kentucky, carrying pioneers, traders, families, and fortune seekers into lands still violently contested. But not every danger on the road came from war, weather, or wilderness. Some came from men. Micajah and Wiley Harp, often called Big Harp and Little Harp, became two of the most feared outlaws in early American history. They were born in North Carolina, likely into a family with loyalist ties during the Revolution, and after the war, they drifted westward through Tennessee and Kentucky. Whether they were brothers or cousins is still debated, but their names became inseparable. By the 1790s, stories of the Harps were spreading across the frontier. Travelers were found murdered near roads, rivers, taverns, and isolated settlements. Some victims were robbed, others seemed to have been killed for no reason at all. Their violence was so extreme, the later writers would call them some of America's earliest serial killers. One of their hunting grounds was the Wilderness Road itself. In 1797, a peddler was found near Barberville, Kentucky, after buzzards drew attention to the body. Around the Holston River, near Knoxville, a man named Johnson disappeared after leaving a rough tavern. Days later, his body was found in the river. Soon after, more victims appeared along the Nashville Road. As word spread, fear traveled faster than official justice. In that time, news moved by word of mouth, and a warning could arrive too late. Settlers began waiting for groups of people before passing through dangerous stretches. The old saying, "there is safety in numbers," had real meaning on roads where one stranger behind you could be fatal. The Harps were eventually captured near Stanford, Kentucky, after the murder of a young traveler named Stephen Langford. But even jail could not hold them for long. They escaped, continued their killing, and moved between frontier settlements and outlaw hideouts, including the infamous Cave-in Rock region along the Ohio River. Their end came in pieces. In 1799, Micajah Harp was pursued by a posse in western Kentucky, shot and killed. His head was cut off and displayed at a crossroads as a warning to other outlaws. The place became known as Harp's Head. Wiley Harp survived a few more years, hiding under aliases until he was captured and hanged in 1804. The Long Hunters of Appalachia. Before the mountain men of the American West, there were the Long Hunters of Appalachia. They were frontier hunters who crossed beyond the settled edge of the colonies and disappeared into the mountains for months at a time. Their name came from the length of their journeys. A long hunt might begin in the fall and not end until spring, with men traveling west from places like Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and the Carolinas into lands beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Many of these expeditions began in the Holston River Valley of southwest Virginia. From there, hunting parties pushed through mountain passes and into what is now Kentucky and Tennessee. They moved through the country that was rich with deer, elk, bear, bison, beaver, and otter, carrying only what they needed: rifles, powder, knives, hatchets, traps, blankets, salt, and pack horses. The goal was profit. Long hunters killed game, cured hides, collected pelts, and brought them back east to sell. A successful hunt could earn far more than farming, but the life was brutal. They faced hunger, sickness, bad weather, dangerous terrain, and the constant risk of losing everything they had gathered. Their camps were rough, isolated, and temporary. Some parties set up base camps, then split into smaller groups of 2 to 3 to range deeper into the wilderness. One of the earliest known camps was established by Elisha Wallen in Powell Valley in 1761. Other famous long hunters included Caspar Mansker, Isaac and Anthony Bledsoe, James Robertson, and the most famous one, Daniel Boone. But the long hunters did more than hunt. They mapped trails, located rivers and salt licks, identified fertile lands, and brought back stories of the country beyond the mountains. Land speculators quickly understood the value of that knowledge. Men like Richard Henderson used it to support massive land schemes, and Boone himself would later help blaze the Wilderness Road through Cumberland Gap, opening a major route for settlers into Kentucky and Tennessee. To later Americans, the Long Hunter became a romantic frontier figure, tough, independent, and skilled enough to survive beyond civilization. But to the Cherokee, Shawnee, and other native peoples, the Long Hunters were intruders. They entered traditional hunting grounds, stripped them of their game, and helped prepare the way for permanent settlement. What began as long hunting trips became part of a much larger push across the mountains, and for that reason, the Long Hunters were not just wanderers, they were the scouts of expansion. Armstrong Mountain Mystery Walls. High above the Kanawha River, on the rugged ridge between Armstrong Creek and Loop Creek in Fayette County, West Virginia, there are ruins that were once passed around as old-timer stories. They were called the Stone Walls of Armstrong Mountain, or the Mount Carbon Stone Walls, and for generations, people in southern West Virginia heard rumors of strange rock formations hidden in the woods just beyond the New River Gorge country. Some imagined ancient fortifications. Others wondered if they had once been enormous animal pens built for some vanished purpose in the deep mountains. But the walls were not just folklore. European settlers appear to have known about them by the early 1800s, and by the late 19th century, archaeologists were trying to make sense of them. They found not cleanly stacked walls, but long rows of loose stone, some curved into a U-shape or horse-like shoe form, running across ridges and down deep slopes. One section was described as being only about 2 feet high, but roughly 20 feet wide. Another was far larger, built from heavy stone and blocks of Kanawha black flint, some of which had apparently been carried uphill from the flint layer below. The site was not small. Early reports spoke of walls stretching for miles, though later surveys suggested several separate segments rather than one continuous barrier. Around them were flint quarries, workshop areas, hammerstones, cairns, and scattered projectile points. Yet, the evidence refused to give a clear answer. No pottery was found to place the site neatly with a known culture. The artifacts were too mixed to create a simple timeline. By the 1950s, Archaeologists and other scholars began to study the walls closely, and old theories began to fall apart. They did not seem well placed for defense. They were too low, too broad, and too strangely situated to work as fortifications. They also made little sense as animal pens, especially in such steep terrain. That left one possibility, but only by elimination. The walls may have had some ceremonial or ritual purpose. Even that remains uncertain. Today, parts of the Armstrong Mountain Works have been damaged or destroyed by mining, and some of what once stood there may already be lost. What remains is a rare Appalachian mystery, some ruins on a lonely mountain ridge, known for 2 centuries, studied by professionals, and still not yet fully understood. William Strange. In the forest of central West Virginia, there is a creek whose name comes from one of the state's strangest pioneer legends. Strange Creek flows through the hills towards the Elk River, in a region that was still deep wilderness near the end of the 18th century. According to the story, the legend began in 1795 when a young man named William Strange entered the Elk Valley with a surveying party. Strange was not the surveyor himself, but the camp cook, responsible for the food, supplies, and utensils, which were carried by a horse. The party was said to have been working near the mouth of Holly River, in a landscape with almost no settlements. The forest was dense, the terrain was confusing, and the memory of violence on the frontier was still fresh. Jeremiah Carpenter, a local guide, had reportedly lost a brother to an Indian attack only a short time before. On the first day in the woods, Strange became separated from the group. The next day, the others searched for him and found signs of his wandering. He had apparently moved back and forth through the forest with his pack horse before finally tying the animal to a bush and continuing on foot. The party followed his trail for several miles. At one point, someone fired a gun, hoping Strange might hear it, but Carpenter warned against making noise, fearing it could draw hostile attention. After that, the trail vanished. William Strange was never seen alive again. Years later, the story says hunters or settlers found human bones beneath a tree on what was then known as Turkey Creek. Nearby were said to be a rifle and shot, and in some versions, the skeleton of his dog. But the detail that turned a frontier tragedy into folklore was carved into the tree above him. The words change from version to version, but the meaning remains the same. Strange is my name, and I'm on strange ground, and strange it is that I can't be found. Other tellings place the bones on different nearby streams, and later historians struggled to locate the exact tree, the exact grave, or even the final path Strange may have taken. Some old guns and bones were found over the years and tied to the legend, but none of that was conclusive. Still, the name remained. Turkey Creek became Strange Creek, preserving the memory of a lost man, a lonely death in the wilderness, and a riddle carved into Appalachian history. Redbird River Petroglyphs. In Clay County, Kentucky, along the Redbird River, there once stood a sandstone slab covered in markings no one has ever fully explained. It was known as the Redbird Petroglyph, or the Redbird River Petroglyphs, or simply Marked Rock. For generations, the stone rested on a bluff near Lower Redbird, overlooking the river that shares its name with Chief Redbird, a legendary Cherokee figure remembered in local tradition. The rock itself was massive, weighing around 50 tons, with an inscribed face roughly 20 feet long and more than 5 feet high. The carvings are sharply cut into the sandstone. Lines, symbols, geometric forms, and figures that have invited more than a century of speculation. Some have viewed them as indigenous petroglyphs, possibly Cherokee, or connected to older native inhabitants of the region. Local tradition has tied them to Chief Redbird and to the clans of his people, with some interpretations seeing possible clan symbols, including the Deer Clan and Bear Clan. But the stone's mystery did not stay simple. In the 20th century, local historian James Burchell argued that the markings were not only Native American, but included characters from several Old World alphabets: Greek, Hebrew, Libyan, Arabic, Iberian Punic, Ogham, Germanic runes, and Tiffin-non-Numidian. According to his theory, the Redbird petroglyph was evidence of pre-Columbian visitors from Europe, the Mediterranean, or North Africa, leaving messages in the Kentucky mountains. Most scholars, however, have been skeptical of that claim. The markings do not form a clear, translatable text in any known language, and many appear closer to geometric rock art than writing. Another possibility is that the surface was marked over a long period of time by different people, native artists, later travelers, settlers, or others adding their own carvings to an already mysterious stone. Then, on December 7th, 1994, heavy rain loosened the slab from its cliff. The Redbird petroglyph broke free and crashed down onto Kentucky Route 66 below. Somehow, the stone survived intact. 2 days later, it was moved to a local park in Manchester, where it now sits under a shelter, fenced and preserved. Its original location was once listed on the National Register of Historic Places, but after the relocation, it was removed from the register. Still, it remains one of Appalachia's strangest artifacts, part Cherokee, part archaeological puzzle, part roadside mystery. Lost children of the Alleghenies. In the woods of Bedford County, Pennsylvania, near what is now Blue Knob State Park, a lonely monument along Sienna Run marks one of northern Appalachia's most haunting stories. On April 24th, 1856, Samuel Cox was eating breakfast with his wife, Susanna, and their children in Spruce Hollow, near the small communities of Lovely and Pavia. When Samuel heard his dog barking in the woods, he left the cabin, hoping it had treed an animal that could provide meat for the family. His 2 oldest boys, George, age 7, and Joseph, age 5, apparently tried to follow him. When Samuel returned by a different path, the children were gone. He and Susanna each thought the boys were with the other. By evening, around 100 neighbors were searching the ridges and ravines. By the next day, nearly 1,000 people were combing the forest, but the woods gave up nothing. As the days passed, rumors spread. Some claimed the boys had been kidnapped. Others pointed suspicion at outsiders, or even at the Cox family itself. One neighbor reportedly tore up the cabin floorboards and dug in the garden, convinced the parents had hidden the bodies. Then, about 12 miles away near Claysburg, a farmer named Jacob Dibbert began having dreams. According to the story, Dibbert dreamed of searching the forest and seeing a series of signs: a dead deer, a child's shoe, a stream crossed by a beech log, and a birch tree with its top broken off. After the dream returned for several nights, he told his wife, Sarah, who recognized the landscape as land near her childhood home. On May 8th, Jacob and his brother-in-law, Harrison Wysong, followed these clues into the woods. They found the deer carcass, then the shoe, then the stream crossing. Finally, along what was then called Gypsy Run, they came to the broken birch. There, among the roots, were George and Joseph Cox. The younger boy's head was said to be resting on his brother's hat, with a smooth stone beneath it like a pillow. The reward money was turned over to the Cox family, who used it for the boy's grave marker. In 1906, a second monument was placed where they were found. That birch tree is now gone, and so is the stone pillow, but the story remains. 2 lost children and one man's recurring strange dream that led to their recovery. The Queen Witch of Clemson. In Clemson, South Carolina, the old stone church has stood for more than 2 centuries, surrounded by graves, frontier history, and one of the region's stranger cemetery legends. The church began as Hopewell Kiwi Presbyterian Church in 1789. Its first congregation worshipped in a log meeting house near the Kiwi River, but after that structure burned, work began on a new stone church in 1797. By 1802, the building was complete. Made from local fieldstone, it became one of the oldest surviving structures in upstate South Carolina. The cemetery around it was even older than the church itself. Revolutionary War General Andrew Pickens is buried there, along with early ministers, soldiers, frontier families, and Osnapa, a Cherokee man whose exact role in the area's history remains uncertain. But among all those graves, one stands apart. It belongs to Eliza Huger, sometimes remembered in local lore as the Witch Queen of Clemson. According to the long-told story, Eliza came from a prominent Charleston family, but left home for New Orleans, where her behavior was considered scandalous even by the standards of that city. In some versions, her brother followed her to bring her home. In others, 2 brothers went after her. The story says they found her either with a lover or in a house of prostitution, and one or both of them shot Eliza and the man she was with. Her body was brought back to South Carolina, but according to legend, churches refused to bury her. The Old Stone Church finally allowed her to be interred in its cemetery, but only under one condition. A stone wall had to be built around the grave to contain her sinful spirit. That wall became part of the legend. It was said to fall apart again and again, no matter how many times people repaired it. Lightning supposedly struck the grave repeatedly, damaging the stone until only the words, "A brother's sorrow," remain clearly remembered. Even today, visitors still leave coins, stones, flowers, or small offerings at Eliza's enclosed grave. Some say tossing a coin brings good luck, but taking one is another matter. The Ghost of Guyan. In Logan County, West Virginia, the town once known as Lawnsville, Logan Courthouse, and briefly Aracoma, was built in a narrow bottom along the Guyandotte River. Long before the courthouse and plank-lined streets, the area had been associated with native burial grounds, frontier violence, and old stories of Aracoma, the Shawnee woman whose name still clings to local legend. By the mid-1800s, the little town had already developed a reputation as a place of hauntings. Residents told stories of giant skeletons uncovered during digging, old Indian relics turned up in cellars, panthers in the hills, curses in the river fog, and ghosts moving near the cemetery and courthouse square. But one spirit became more feared than the rest: the ghost of an enslaved man known in local lore as Black Bill, or Bloody Bill. The legend goes back to December 27th, 1847, when Anne Lawson, widow of merchant Anthony Lawson, was brutally attacked in her home. According to the story, 2 enslaved men, Bill and Lewis, had been drinking during the holiday season and planned to rob her. Bill was accused of striking Anne with an iron poker, or coal shovel, while she was inside the Lawson house. She lived long enough to identify him, and both men were captured. Lewis was sent away. Bill was hanged from an elm tree near the courthouse square. Afterward, stories spread that his body had been buried carelessly, like a dog, and that his spirit could not rest. People claimed to see him at night near the courthouse, the cemetery, the river, or peeping into windows from outside. The figure was described as ragged, bulging-eyed, and broken-necked, still bearing the mark of the hanging tree. One of the strangest accounts connects the ghost to Thomas Dunn English, the poet, writer, politician, and author of Ben Bolt. English had come to Guyandotte country seeking opportunity in coal and timber, and for a time helped shape the town itself, even renaming it Aracoma. According to the tale, after an evening of food, music, and old frontier stories at the home of William Stratton, English walked home through the darkened town. Passing the courthouse elm and the Lawson property, he became overwhelmed by the stories he had heard that night. Near the fence, he saw a dark figure following him. Later, in his room, he reportedly saw the apparition again, silent, haggard, and watching from the corner. Soon after, English left town, and local legend has claimed he was ran off by Bloody Bill. The Red-Headed Man of Dorsey's Knob. On the southern edge of Morgantown, West Virginia, Dorsey's Knob rises above the Monongahela River, a scenic overlook now known for trails, picnics, and views of the city below. But in local ghost lore, the summit is also home to one of Monongalia County's most gruesome spirits. He is known as the Red-Headed Man. The story reaches back to the 1770s, when Morgantown was still a fragile frontier settlement guarded by small forts, including Fort Coben near present-day Dorsey's Knob. Across the Monongahela lay the Ohio country, and tensions between settlers and native peoples had grown violent after years of raids, retaliation, and broken peace. In the spring of 1778, a native raiding party entered the county. A group of settlers had been planting corn about a mile from Fort Coben and were returning under armed escort when they were ambushed from the roadside brush. Most escaped back to the fort, but 2 men were caught in the attack. Jacob Miller was killed outright. John Woodfin was shot in the thigh and trapped beneath his dying horse. According to the legend, Woodfin was taken alive to the rocks on top of Dorsey's Knob. There, within the side of the fort below, he was tied to 2 poles lashed into the shape of an X. His captors then tortured and killed him, leaving his body on the summit as a warning to the other settlers. But Woodfin did not stay buried in the past. For generations, visitors to Dorsey's Knob have told of encountering a blood-red figure moving through the park. He appears to hikers, families, and couples parked on the overlook, his head and face raw and terrible, as if the wounds of 1778 never healed. Some versions say he is not only angry, but searching for what was taken from him. The red-headed man is said to attack the living, trying to steal the skin from their faces and scalps to replace his own. There is one owed protection against him, though. Those who know the story sometimes carry a small X made from 2 sticks tied together, either in a pocket or on a windshield. Supposedly, Woodfin still fears the shape of the frame that he died on. The Vanished Conisty. A few miles south of Brevard, North Carolina, a small roadside marker sits near the intersection of US 276 and Island Ford Road. Weathered by rain and time, it marks the supposed site of Canasta, or Conisty, a Cherokee village remembered as one of western North Carolina's strangest lost settlements. According to the plaque, the British troops first found the village in 1725. When explorers returned decades later, the settlement was gone. No people, no clear explanation, just a story that had already begun to drift from history into legend. Historians believe Canasta was a real Cherokee village, likely located somewhere near present-day Conisty Falls, along important travel and trade routes between the North Carolina mountains and the South Carolina foothills. Its exact location has never been confirmed archaeologically, and some researchers think it may have been abandoned around the 1750s, earlier than the 1777 date on the marker. But the Cherokee legend gives the disappearance another meaning. In the story recorded by James Mooney, the people of Canasta were visited by the Nunahi, the mysterious spirit beings who lived in the hidden towns beneath the mountains. The Nunahi warned the villagers that danger was coming and invited them to take shelter in their own hidden world. The people fasted for 7 days. Then, when they were ready, they followed the Nunahi toward a nearby mountain. Some versions say the entrance opened behind a waterfall near Conisty Falls. Beyond it was another realm, green pastures, deep woods, and a village more beautiful than the one they left behind. The people of Canasta stepped through and vanished from our world. One person refused to go. Because of that refusal, the entrance closed behind the others and turned solid, sealing the doorway forever. In historical terms, the village may have simply relocated, joined another Cherokee town, or dispersed under the pressure of war, disease, and colonial expansion. But in the old story, the people of Conisty escaped the suffering that would later come to so many Cherokee communities. Alright guys, this has been a long run, but we're going to close it out with Boojum. Deep in the Balsam Mountains of western North Carolina, especially around Haywood County, the old stories say something tall and shaggy once watched from the ridges. Locals called him the Boojum. He was said to live somewhere along the cliffs, caves, and balsam groves near Waynesville and the Plot Balsams. Most descriptions make him out to be about 8 feet tall, covered in thick gray hair, with a face almost human, but not quite. He was usually seen at dusk, standing on rocky outcroppings or slipping between the trees. Sometimes he was heard instead, a strange moan or a hoot echoing through the woods. The Boojum was not usually described as violent, but he had 2 unusual obsessions. The first was gemstones. The mountains of western North Carolina are known for its rubies, sapphires, emeralds, amethyst, and quartz, and the Boojum was said to collect them obsessively. He hid his treasure in caves, sometimes inside old stone or liquor jugs. In some versions, he protected the gems by filling the jugs with strong mountain liquor. Any treasure hunter foolish enough to drink it would fall into a deep sleep, giving the Boojum time to return and reclaim what was his. His second obsession was pretty women. By the early 1900s, women sometimes bathed in secluded mountain streams and springs, and stories spread of a hairy figure Peering from behind rhododendron and mountain laurel. Most women who saw him ran screaming back home, which usually sent angry men into the woods to hunt the creature. But the Budjum was never caught. Then came Annie. According to the best-known version of the legend, Annie was bathing in a mountain stream when she noticed Budjum watching her. But unlike the others, she did not run. She looked into his lonely eyes and fell in love. Against her family's wishes, Annie left human society behind and went to live with him in the Bosoms. But even love could not cure the Budjum's hunger for gemstones. He still wandered off at night, searching for treasures, leaving Annie alone in the dark. To find him, she developed a strange call, part owl hoot and part wild mountain cry. The Budjum would answer, and the two would call back and forth across the ridges until they found each other again. Some say that is the origin of the word hootenanny. Alright guys, this brings us to the conclusion of this really long video that I've been wanting to do for a while. Let me know in the comment section below if you enjoyed it and would like to see similar things in the future. For now, I say goodbye and good night.